In a gloomy room, its walls stained with blood. A lone window specks the middle of the wall, filling the room with moonlight. A girl with dark hair looks outside the window at the full moon. Her luxurious white dress is stained with blood, as is her face. There is a look of horror on her face. Suddenly the door behind her opens. A white-haired, neatly dressed boy enters the room. Apparently he was looking for the girl. The little one is badly frightened by the stranger's visit. Her legs fail, and she sits down on the floor. Subsequently, she tries to crawl away. All the while, the girl is screaming. The boy tells her not to be afraid. He walks over to the girl who has fallen to the floor and tells her that it's okay, and he will protect her. Tears appear in the girl's eyes. She tries to say something, but only incomprehensible sounds come out. The girl starts to cry. The boy hugs her and repeats in a calm voice that everything is all right because she belongs to him. A smirk appears on the guy's face. The girl is already in the field picking potatoes. She catches a glimpse of a man waving at her. The blue-haired girl can't speak. She thinks it was caused by fright after the accident. She says it's most likely because she has no memory of the accident herself. The maid must take the potatoes to the castle as soon as possible. As she walks towards the castle, she hears the clatter of hooves behind her. It turned out to be the crown prince. The girl's face shows a look of fright. The boy rides gracefully up to her and stops. The girl falls to the ground. The young man, meanwhile, asks her what is the matter with obvious mockery. She tries to scream and cry, tries to apologize to Mr. Gregory. She says that she is very sorry. The girl explains that the bucket was heavy. She tried very hard but dropped it on the ground. The prince is clearly not in the mood. He demands that the girl not play dumb. The prince says that she communicates perfectly well with Camille. The girl tries to say something, but Gregory continues to accuse the girl. He reminds them that he is the firstborn son of the Marquis of Lafayette. Gregory doesn't understand why everyone is flocking to Camille if the crown prince, he's the crown prince. Guy says it's because of people like her, who idolize him, that his brother is so frivolous. Gregory grabs the girl by the hair and pulls, yelling that he is the crown prince and cannot be ignored. His outrageous behavior is stopped by a guy who bursts into the conversation. The prince, being angry, walks away. The girl waved at the satisfied grandfather. She slammed the door shut, leaned back against it, and exhaled, rubbing her shoulder. Her body felt like it was begging for rest. The young man tells the girl not to worry and that he will always be with her. The boy asks if she is scared, but the girl starts to cry. She says that thanks to him she is safe. He saved her. Terry was glad they hadn't stayed up all night, which angered his mistress, who clung to him. Clearly he should have been concerned about her condition, not such triviality. She says he shouldn't be doing this. However, Camille admits that he just wants to be with her, so he asks if it's okay. The girl is embarrassed and blushes. Terry mused that if he too were a native of a certain Descentia, he too, like his mistress, would boast of an amazing ability, and there, lo and behold, he'd be working for the Knights of Riesel instead of all that. As a servant in the empire of the former Marquis of Lafayette, the Marquis's second son, Mr. Camille, possesses an arcana capable of temporarily weakening illnesses and curses. According to the doctor, the girl is unable to speak due to mental trauma. But while Mr. Camille's arcana is working on her, she regains the ability to speak. Camille helps the girl carry the bucket of potatoes to the building. At that moment, the maid opens the door, with a shout, trying to ask something to the girl. Immediately, the prince apologizes for the trouble caused. He wonders what the girl will do now. The girl says that she needs to wash the potatoes now. She asks her to wait for a while, after which she apologizes to the second maid. While the girl washes the potatoes, Camille apologizes once more, saying that she is so unhappy. The maid can't understand why Mr. Camille cares so much about this girl, and then promises herself that she won't let the blue-haired maid get away with it. The prince covers his mouth with his hand and smiles. In the evening, having hung all her clothes out to dry, the girl sits on the hay. She realizes that she has failed again today. She promises herself that tomorrow she will try to do everything so that she will not be scolded and that she can only make trouble for Mr. Camille. Outside the cabin, she hears rustling, human footsteps. At this time, someone approaches with a broom in his hands. The girl is clearly frightened by what is happening. It turned out to be Mr. Gregory. In one of his hands was a whip, and in the second an empty bottle. He starts hitting the girl with these things, shouting about how stupid everyone is that they can only hide behind Camille's back. He wants to hear cries of pain. However, not getting what he wants, he tisks, tells her she's a boring woman, and leaves. After he leaves, she is glad that he just beat her up. But he has never broken into her room like that before. She gets scared, but the thought of Mr. Camille helps her to calm down. When the maid arrives the next day, she throws a wet rag over the girl's head and tells her that she is late, then calls her lazy. The girl immediately begins to apologize, but the maid demands not to piss her off and to wash the plates. When the girl leaves with the bucket, the servants start discussing her. They don't understand why she is so clumsy, and they say that such people are usually dismissed at once. Then another servant intervenes and asks them to stop discussing her, because listening to them, she starts to get angry. Mr. Camille enters the room. He says that tonight's dinner was excellent, and he personally decided to thank everyone. Mr. Camille looks over to the maids from time to time and thanks them, though he is an aristocrat and is not obliged to do so. The maids loved the master, but he was curious about one thing, so he decided to ask where Julia was. The maids have a look of dislike on their faces. They don't understand why he wants the girl. They hope that he is only asking because Julia might make a mess. Camille says he didn't see her and got worried. He asks one if she can bake her a brioche. She would bake anything for Mr. Camille, but she clearly doesn't want to do it for this girl. You can't waste butter and sugar on a servant girl. It might make the gentleman angry. Even she, the kitchen worker, takes only the leftovers and doesn't understand why this girl is allowed to do such a thing. Camille says that if anyone asks, let them answer that it is on his orders. The prince says he's counting on her and leaves the kitchen. All the maids are puzzled. Returning to the kitchen, Julia immediately receives a portion of the dish on her head. It was the maid who was entrusted with the task of preparing the girl's brioche. She says it's her food and that she has to clean up now. Julia doesn't understand what's going on. She thinks she has made a mistake again. She wants someone to explain to her why she is a troublemaker. She wants to disappear. Tears come to her eyes, but she tells herself not to cry and to finish her work as soon as possible. Camille watches the cleaning process from behind the ajar door. He thinks she's cute. After her work, Julia sits in her den again. She thinks that she pissed everyone off again today and ended up hungry. She realizes how hungry she is. From now on, she will try not to make mistakes. Then tomorrow, everything will be fine. Pressed against the wall, Julia begins to cry. Mr. Gregory shows up at her again in the night with questions about what she did today. He yells, saying he will teach her how to behave properly tonight. He mocks her, slaps her hard, and grabs her hair. He draws water from the well and walks back to the lodge. Julia asks the gentleman to stop. He asks if she still wants to chat, says that everyone and Camille are just in cahoots, and wonders how much longer they plan to make a fool of him. Sonador said that, unfortunately, she couldn't help, as direct contact with a person was necessary to use her power. But she, an ordinary craftswoman, could not touch His Highness so easily, considering it an insult to a noble and great family. 5. That was a problem, but there was no choice either. The Emperor sighed and said that Sonador was their last hope, therefore he would accept anything in this situation. He promised to pay any money for her success, and therefore asks to serve lunch in the garden. However, if she suddenly refused, he could not guarantee her safety and integrity, for she now knew the secret of the Emperor himself. It is unthinkable to dine with gentlemen, especially for this girl. She is the oldest of the servants, but can't remember the lord ever calling her by name. She comes into the kitchen with the other maids and tells them that the prince wants to dine in the garden, so they need to prepare something simple and 2 servings. It seemed that the 500-year-old curse was still working. The duke's son had been weak in body and mind since birth, and on the day of his majority, he fell asleep. He doesn't understand why. But the head maid says she doesn't like it either. They've been serving the lords for so many years, but they don't so much as dine with them. They even hesitate to call them by name. No one understands why this girl has what they don't. They justify it by saying that she is pitiful to look at. She can't remember anything. and she can't even say a word. The older maid agrees, but reminds her that this is Mr. Camille's order. One of the maids wonders where Julia is. The cook says she should be cleaning the pantry today. The maid comes up with a great idea. Julia finally finishes cleaning the pantry. She decides to go back in and take a short break. Suddenly, on the other side, the maid locks the gate to the storeroom, leaving her inside. The girl didn't understand how this could happen, as she didn't know it was done on purpose. She thinks she wasn't noticed inside. She assumes that someone did it on purpose, but now it doesn't matter so much. Someone must have noticed her. For a very long time she bangs on the door with her fists. They are already all abrasions, but there is no result. She sits with her back against the wall and realizes that no one can hear her. She can only wait for someone to open the door. Suddenly, a key is inserted into the keyhole and the door is opened. Behind her was the cook and one of the maids. They ask if she has been hiding. Julia says that she is locked in here, but the maid slaps her hard and tells her that she is a useless girl and that Mr. Camille invited her to dinner. Julia doesn't know what she is talking about. The maid tells her not to make excuses and that she is amazed at her behavior. She also says that Julia will clean the table after dinner tonight. She will have to wash the dishes, clean the cutlery, rake the ashes from the stove, and mop the floor, all of which Julia will have to do alone. The maid says that she has spoiled Mr. Camille's mood, and in her opinion, she has gotten off too lightly today. Julia realizes that the gentleman has invited her, but this has never happened before. But if they're telling the truth, she must have done a terrible thing. Already scrubbing the floors, Camille comes into the hall. He wonders if Julia is the only one working today and asks where the others are. Julia tries to explain everything to him, but he interrupts her and tells her that whatever the reason, everything is fine and she shouldn't worry. She doesn't give up trying to tell him everything, but he interrupts her again and pities her. He hugs her and tells her not to cry. In his head, he thinks to himself that he liked her, even when she was crying in the pantry. He says that if she isn't disgusted by him, then everything is fine. Julia, through her tears, asks why he's being so nice to her. He replies that she's a cutie. Walking through the forest, Camille asks Julia if it is hard for her to work. The girl replies that everything is fine, but she can't talk, and she can't communicate with anyone. She thinks that she only causes inconvenience to everyone, and for this she often has to apologize. Camille asks if he should intervene. Julia replies that she can't bother him again. Besides, she wants to manage on her own, because all the people here are actually good. Therefore, she intends to work hard to become more useful. She can no longer rely on Mr. Camille all the time. Mr. Camille asks her not to say such sad things to her. A sadness appears on his face. The girl does not understand what is happening. He comes up to her and embraces her. Camille admits to Julia that he likes her. The girl is even more confused. He wonders if she has noticed it herself, his feelings. Julia begins to say that it is not allowed, after all. She is a simple servant. Camille asks if she is really bothered by this difference in their position and the fact that he belongs to the Lafayette family. He is only the second son and will inherit no title or fortune of the family. He has nothing but a noble name. Julia asks him not to talk like that. She calls him a fine man. She says he is very kind, that he cares even for her, a mere servant. In these matters, the heir's nurse might be of assistance. The girl had already lit up with excitement, hoping for her salvation and an easy job. But the Duke finished with the story of the execution of this lovely aunt, who was the consort of the Marquis of Ambrose. She was not in the habit of keeping her mouth shut, which was It is getting dark, so Camille offers to walk her home and says that it is dangerous to walk alone at this time. He says that at this hour some mad dog could get lost. Gregory is watching from behind a tree. When she gets home, Julia remembers the day's events, her walk with the prince and his confession. She thinks he was only joking, because she is just a maid. Julia realizes that she cannot even speak now, and she does not remember her past. In any case, Mr. Camille's mere affection for her would not be enough. But even if the confession was serious, hearing it from such a fine man is very important to her. A smile appears on Julia's face. She wonders if it might make her happy for a little while. Meanwhile, Gregory at the manor is furious. He smashes a vase on the floor. He says everyone's an idiot and that he's the eldest son of the Lafayette family. Everything in this house belongs to him. Even that girl belongs only to him, not Camille. He visits Julia's house. He knocks on the door and demands to open it. The girl is frightened and thinks that he has come to beat her up again. When she opens the door, she sees that he looks different. Gregory pounces on Julia and says he will make her remember who she belongs to. Julia asks him to stop, but Gregory says that he is the heir to the family, and no matter what he does, she has no right to resist him. He calls the girl worthless. Before he can say this, he hears Camille's voice from behind the door. He wanted to give her the handkerchief she had forgotten. From the room, he hears the voice of a girl. She asks for help. Camille enters the cabin and sees Gregory, who clearly had bad intentions. He grabs the heir of the family by his clothes and begins to shout. He asks how dare he even think of such a thing. He says that Julia is exactly the same person as they are, like father and mother. Gregory is clearly frightened, but he won't budge. He says that you can't compare this filth with people of noble blood, and that he will dispose of his inheritance as he pleases. But seeing the abrupt change in Camille's face, Gregory bullets out of the room. Camille immediately turns to the girl. She is happy to see him and begins to cry. Camille apologizes. After he has calmed Julia, visits the heir of the family. Gregory sat in the darkened room, badly frightened, and when he saw Camille in the doorway, he was even more frightened, so much so that he couldn't even speak clearly. Camille demands that he tell him what he was going to do to Julia. According to him, up to this point, he had let Gregory get away with abusing her, but now he suddenly claimed her as his property. He's not happy that Gregory would steal something from him. The heir falls to his knees and apologizes, saying he was wrong. Camille kicks him in the head and asks if the man by whose favor he was still heir was thinking. He says that taking that title away from him would have been easier for Camille than candy from a child. Gregory, still on his knees, continues to apologize and says it won't happen again. Camille, saying that this will not happen again, kicks Gregory again, only in the neck, and tells him not to forget himself because he has been dancing to his tune so far. Camille promises that if he continues to dance to his tune, he will allow him to remain heir to the family. With these words, their conversation ends, and Camille leaves the room as if nothing had happened. Walking away from the room, Camille decides to have a glass of wine, but notices a glow from under the door from the other room. He sees one of the maids dirtying the kitchen and scattering garbage. The last person to leave the kitchen yesterday was Julia. Now this maid is going to blame her for the mess. Camille thinks she's an idiot. He decides to get the wine first, and then on his way back, grab the cheese and go into the kitchen. He realizes that the more attention he gives Julia, the more the maids will become jealous, and the more often they will mock her. Gregory was the same story. He beats Julia on and off, and it's all just to vent his anger. After all, he feels that Camille is superior to him in many ways, and these actions are his way of feeling more confident. He sits and drinks his wine, thinking that his brother is so stupid that he even feels sorry for him. He argues that it is like a vicious circle. He cares for Julia, so the servants abuse her, and Gregory takes out his aggression on her. In the end, Julia is left all alone, and the deeper she sinks into this loneliness, the more she depends on his care. He thinks Julia is very nice. The cook comes into the kitchen. He sees the mess that is going on in there and asks what it is. Immediately he turns to Julia and asks if it's her doing. He knows that she was the last one to leave the kitchen yesterday. Julia was indeed the last to leave, but the kitchen was in perfect order. Just then, Camille shows up in the kitchen and greets everyone. He said he had borrowed some wine and cheese last night, and now he had come to return the open bottle. But he didn't know much about him, saying that he obeyed His Majesty personally. The girl lowered her head, realizing that there was nothing to catch her here either. Invite Julia to dinner and asks if she is here. He notices the mess on the floor and asks what it is. They all say they don't know. They've just arrived. They say that yesterday Julia was the last one out of the kitchen. He realizes that this mess is clearly not her doing. The cook asks how he knows, and Camille says that last night when he came here for cheese, there wasn't a speck of dust. Finished her work and left, he suggests. Camille says that something must have happened later, that someone broke in here and made all this mess. He suggests that someone probably wanted to frame Julia, who was the last to leave the kitchen, and that someone clearly hates her. Julia watches all this and doesn't know what to say. Camille says that they have no time at all to look for the culprit and that it would be very bad if they were detained tomorrow. He says that Mother will fight. He offers to help clean the kitchen, but the cook says it's not worth it. The only way to enter the palace undetected was through a secret passage through which the knight must guide the master with her partner. He immediately says it's okay, and also says that he knows she didn't do it. Julia makes excuses in her head that she has nothing to do with it. She believes that the blame for what happened lies with her. After all, she is the one who caused someone to hate her so much. But she does not understand why, while everyone is angry with her, Mr. Camille remains so kind to her. Camille interrupts her musings and offers to clean up together. She apologizes for being so spoiled. The maid is watching all this, and on her face clearly shows hatred for Julia. Camille noticed this look and smiled. He realized that this maid would be easy to control. Julia begins to remember everything that has happened to her in all this time. She has already made everyone uncomfortable enough. Mr. Camille is very kind to her and indulges her. She feels that it can't just go on like this. She wants to work even harder. She also remembers all of Camille's words during the walk through the woods and promises herself that she will do her best for those words alone. After a while, he drinks coffee in the hall. The head maid is standing next to him, and he asks her where girls from low-class families usually buy clothes. The maid hoped she had heard what she heard, she asks again, to which she receives a positive answer. Camille is not referring to holiday outfits or work uniforms. He is only interested in what ordinary girls usually wear on weekends. The knight wished Sonidor to brace herself and hold on, for in her hands was the fate of an entire empire, as well as the master's who would gain long-awaited freedom if she succeeded. Special attention to a maid, just because he feels sorry for her. To which Camille says that she is as human as he is. If he has to look down on Julia just because of her background, then he should change his attitude towards the older maid as well, he thinks. The fact that she has a certain amount of power in her hands does not make her cease to be a servant. However, he says he doesn't hold the servant for furniture and is unwilling to think otherwise. He says that she cares for him more than she cares for herself. So how can he even allow the idea that an older maid is somehow inferior to him? He says he just wants to be polite to those around him. He wonders why neither his father, his mother, nor his brother can understand that. It seemed to him that the older maid should have understood him. He walks over and kisses her hand, which the maid did not expect. Lately, he says, he has been trying to take care of Julia only because he sees that she is having a hard time, but the maid is dearest to him. He says that she has always been so kind to him. She notes that hearing such words from her master was very nice, because he has always been too kind. She realizes that she needs to pull herself together and sees that it is time to eat breakfast and get back to work. Another maid comes up behind her and apologizes. She asks if she can see the lady, because there is something she needs to tell her. The knight was outraged by such a ridiculous and dubious comparison, because the place they were in was still part of the palace, so he asked her not to use that kind of language anymore. He's a bore, she thought. The conversation concerns Mr. Camille. The older maid realizes that she would otherwise have done so herself, but now she must be sure that the mistress finds out. She says that Mr. Camille will probably keep quiet. She once again wonders what the matter is. The second maid starts that this girl has made Mr. Camille help her with cleaning around the kitchen. The older maid becomes concerned. She loudly interjects again what the maid said and says that this is unacceptable. She thinks she won't allow Mr. Camille to be insulted in this way. Suddenly, the mistress enters the kitchen. The entire staff greets her and asks what they can do for her. She demands with hatred on her face that Julia be brought to her immediately. The servants obey and bring Julia into the kitchen. Everyone looks at her. Julia sees her mistress in front of her and is very surprised. She does not understand why she has come to the kitchen and what is going on. While Terry is busy averting his eyes, Sonidor will do the treatment. But could he do it with his acting skills? He was talentless in her eyes, but sometimes he was good at something. Sits in his room reading a book. Suddenly, Gregory bursts in screaming. Camille does not understand why he is shouting and asks him if he even knows how to knock. Gregory continues to shout and says that Julia is in trouble. Immediately after Julia is taken away, she is beaten with a stick. She still does not understand why and asks for a reason. The servant who does this tells her that she is to be caned 100 times and then thrown out of the manor. Before she was taken away, Mistress demanded that Julia not be seen by Mr. Camille again. Mistress also demanded that no pity be shown to the girl. As she lies there, she worries that she won't see Mr. Camille again. But Sonidor was concerned with another unresolved issue. She still hadn't been fed dinner, so she hurriedly asked the knight about it. He in turn snorted and replied that she should first treat His Highness, and only then would she get food. But now he cleans the floors alongside them. The girl made a pretty face and asked him not to push her, because she was already having a hard time. She already knew she couldn't do it quickly. He realizes in his head that more and more people in this house hate her. He thought that if he could get the servants to favor her, no one would talk about her anymore. It was just an excuse to start treatment as soon as possible, and not to argue. Still, even from such a stern knight, a caring gesture could be expected. He remembered the very cherry cake that the craftswoman had told him about in town, and brought it to her. The girl pretended to be a naughty girl, and threatened that the blame for her sudden awakening due to hunger would rest on the knight's shoulders. But the man was not to be fooled, and he ordered her to begin her work. Julia was taken somewhere in the woods and left on the road. The girl snorted, sensing her defeat, leisurely removed her glove and took the sleeping prince's strong hand, sinking into his dreams. Here. She gets up off the road and decides to find a place to hide. In an instant, she began to fall into a dark place full of stars and unknown bodies, exactly like the cosmic sky. She had to find a way into the Crown Prince's subconscious. But surprisingly, the portal to this unknown world, which no one had given her any information about, was right in front of her, as if luring her into its domain. Normally, when a person was cursed, their consciousness was hard to find. But His Highness's mind flickered like the Sonidor entered the passage and found herself in a black and white world, as if the prince had been afflicted with achromasia. The world was completely devoid of bright colours. A young man approaches the girl on the ground and takes her in his arms. The driver says there is a slum nearby, and he thinks she is probably from there. The gentleman sees her blood on his hands. He cannot understand what has happened to her. Holding the girl in his arms, he decides to take her to his estate. At that moment, Camille learns the news that Julia has been chased away. He wonders what it all means. He thought she was just being punished, but the older servant tells him that the mistress ordered her to be caned and kicked out of the manor. She also goes on to say that this girl clearly forgot her place and made him help her with the cleaning. Camille grabs the older maid by the neck and squeezes her hard. He says that if she doesn't take her back to him, he will kill her. The maid is very badly frightened. He says that Julia's world begins with him and ends with him. There should be nothing in it but himself. He wonders what will happen when Julia sees life outside the manor. Camille moves away from the maid sitting on the floor and says that he would go after her right away, but he doesn't want to incur his mother's wrath. Running away from the creepy place, the girl came across something that was much more dangerous. She saw a huge dragon, whose head had already been cut off by an unknown creature. He can't let that happen. The older maid turns to him and asks him why he is working so hard for this maid. He replies that Julia belongs to him. At the same time, an enraged Gregory asks the very man who took Julia to the forest if he did it. The young man does not understand what Mr. Gregory is saying. The latter says that there was no one else to do it but him. Gregory is angry, asking if he threw her out. The young man is very much frightened and does not know what to say. At the same time, Gregory beats him with a stick until he is bloody and asks him if he likes it. If he doesn't want to die, he is obliged to bring the girl back, and quickly. The man starts to say that his mistress ordered it and he cannot disobey her. Gregory responds by kicking him hard and saying that there was no order to leave him somewhere specific, so he proposes to make a play on that. Gregory says that if anyone asks him where he left Julia, let him say that he has it himself. He also continues that if the man answers exactly like that, no one will accuse him of anything. At the conclusion of their conversation, he orders that Julia be found. Julia wakes up in an unfamiliar room. She does not realize what this place is. A young gentleman is watching all this and is happy that she is already awake. She looks at him and doesn't realize who he is. He asks her how she is feeling. Just then, Julia realizes that he doesn't know that she can't speak, Mr. suggests. Julia waves her head negatively. Looking at him, she wonders what to do and assumes he is disappointed. He notices this and apologizes, as he did not intend to rebuke her. First, he asks permission to introduce himself. Julia thinks that this man is obviously of high social standing, but he sits down next to her out of politeness. He introduces himself and says that his name is Glenn de Vestris and that he holds the title of Duke of their country. The girl is shocked that he is a duke, but his inner world was rather frightening. Sonador asked if the prince had been stressed lately, to which she received the knight's incredulous question about the meaning of the condition. Yes, he was because of all those wounds on her back. He couldn't leave her in that condition, so he made the decision to take her with him to the mansion. He also says she was unconscious for 3 days. He assumes her back is still hurting and asks how she is feeling. Julia replies that everything is fine now, but before that, he wanted to ask her some questions, but she can neither speak nor write. He thinks there is no way at all, but he doesn't want to use it. First of all, he says that she needs to eat. Hart says that Julia hasn't eaten in days and asks her to take her time as they bring her a dish. There is a look of joy on her face, and Glenn watches it all. As she eats, he examines her and notices that her manners aren't perfect, but she definitely knows etiquette. Revolutions see that he is clearly upset. He's thinking about something and asks who she is. Julia realizes that even she doesn't know who she is and remembers everything that has happened to her in her entire life. At this time, Camille approaches the cottage where Julia used to live and looks at it longingly. Another girl comes up behind him and asks him to forget Julia, saying that she is only a servant like herself and that their lives are ordered by the lords. She also says that he has the right to do whatever he wants to her. Camille then says that he will do so and hits her in the face with his fist. He wonders with anger on his face if she snitched on Julia and says he doesn't know her name, but he remembers her indifferent face well. He continues to kick her and asks how she could think of such a thing, so that he would forget Julia, and asks that she was joking. He says that an ugly woman like her dare not tell him to forget Julia, and calls her repulsive. He says that Julia is his and his alone, and leaves the cabin with the beaten maid. He walks along the woods and remembers the time with Julia. He wants to know where she is. Julia shows the doctor the abrasions on her back. Everyone is horrified. The doctor asks Julia to turn around. After an unsuccessful attempt to speak, the doctor says they are done for the day. He advises to rub the ointment he prescribed carefully and not to forget the bandages, saying that she should not overexert herself now. The doctor leaves the room and is met by the Duke and asked how things are going. The doctor says that there will likely be some scars on his back, and quite unpleasant ones at that. However, he continues, there is no bone or nerve damage. Her injuries should not show up in everyday life, the doctor says. Sonador didn't understand what paradise he was talking about, so the prince didn't realize that what was happening was just a dream. Maybe he wasn't cursed at all. In which case, he can hardly help. He doesn't get the impression that this girl grew up in the slums. He says there is no rudeness in her demeanor. She carries herself with dignity. You don't see that in someone who grew up in the slums. She was probably just left there after her wounds were inflicted. The Duke reasoned that if that was the case, she had a place to go back to, but at the same time, he thought it was the other way around, because if she had been left in the slums, it was unlikely that she would be welcome home. The prince thought she might be able to answer the question he had long wanted to ask. At that moment, a maid entered the room with a tray full of fruit in her hands, but her body was missing its head, just like the dragon's. Impossible. Still, he sees that they are like 2 peas in a pod. A week later, the Duke walks into Julia's room and sees her wiping the windows. He asks her what she is doing, and Julia turns around with fear on her face. He says he's not mad at her, but she doesn't have to clean the place. Julia didn't think he was angry, but servants should always bow in the presence of aristocracy. Glenn continues that she's injured and shouldn't be allowed to do any cleaning. Julia thinks that she has already caused him a lot of trouble, so she wanted to help at least with that. She tries to tell him that she's quite healthy now. He comes over and takes her in his arms. Julia doesn't understand what's going on. He says it's too early for her to leave the room and asks how she's going to follow the doctor's orders. He continues that until he authorizes it, she needs to lie in the room and rest. Julia sits on the bed and realizes that she needs something to write on. Glenn sees her trying to show something and assumes she wants a pen and paper. He asks if she remembers anything. He gives her a pad and pen and the girl starts drawing. She drew a two-headed bird. Glenn suddenly realizes that it is a double-headed eagle, the symbol of the Marquis's house. He assumes that's where she's from. He doesn't understand what the hell it is. The Marquis values purity of blood and position in society more than anything else. He is insanely proud of his lineage, dating back to the founding of the Kingdom of Arcadia. As it is easy to understand, he despises those below him and takes revenge on those above him. He is an extremely bossy man, and his wife is a cruel woman. The couple consider the employees of their estate as mere tools. If they do not like something, they do not hesitate to spank a servant girl on the royal floor. They seem to have a few children, but they don't appear socially. Glenn knew all this. He reasoned that in any case, the offspring of the Lafayette couple must have character to match. If this girl worked in the Marquis's house, she had been mistreated up to that point, he reasoned. Otherwise, the entities living in the world of the sleeper would immediately push her back into the real world. However, the prince already knew that what was happening was not real, and there were not so many entities around. There was only one headless maid. It's as if she wants to go back soon. He puts his hand on his forehead and doesn't realize it's a delusion. He thinks it's too bad they can't understand each other. Glenn's memories come back. He sees his mother asking him how long he's going to keep messing with her head. He remembers standing next to Suzanne and addressing her. He asked why Mummy cried all the time and why Daddy didn't come home. She was addressing the young master. The Duke's father was a worthless man. He didn't fulfill the duties of a duke and easily wasted all his money on women and gambling. His mother tried to turn his attention to the children, but it was no use. She only cursed his mistresses. Little Glenn asked Suzanne why neither Mummy nor Daddy came to see him. She told him that he would understand when he grew up and that everything would be all right. She would hug him and tell him he had her. The prince said to be quiet and noticed with a smile that a maid was already sharpening her knives on the snake. He explained that although she couldn't see without her head, she could hear perfectly well. In this way, she fueled his distrust of his wife. Not only did she crawl with the Duke, but she gained her father's trust. At one point, Glenn saw his mother's body in a puddle and asked Susanna what had happened. With an equally soft smile, the prince added that it was best not to say the word, for the malevolence of these creatures was no joke. The snake was touched that His Highness had just... As an adult, Glenn believes that people are willing to do anything to get what they want. He can't understand why he hasn't used his arcana to look into a person's soul and see their ugliness. He also thinks about Julia. Her real intentions are unknown to him. He thinks that if he uses the arcana and finds out that she is no different from Susanna, that she is also duplicitous, can he take it? He needed to go back, but only the master could show him the way. Perhaps he would have to follow her, but it wasn't that simple. He says she just can't sit still. Glenn decides to use his harness, otherwise Julia will just get sick of it. Besides, he wants to know a little more about her. Julia sees the smile on his face and is glad that he finally smiled at her. She is very happy about it. Watching her inner world and talking to her, Glenn's face changes. At the same time, Julia says that he is as kind as Mr. Camille. He strokes her head even though she doesn't deserve it in any way. Julia says she can't sleep all day long and wants to thank Glenn somehow. Glenn sees no hint that the girl is hiding anything and doesn't believe such people exist. He gets down on one knee and asks if she's that tired of sitting still. Julia replies that she wants to repay him for his kindness and be useful. She wants to thank him and return to the Lafayette estate. She says that Mr. Camille must be worried. She should tell him as soon as possible that she is okay and apologize for making him worry. She says she wants to see Mr. Camille. Glenn makes a questioning expression with a strange look on his face. Noticing this, the Duke says it's okay and apologizes. After the conversation, he gives her 2 errands to run. 1, she'll help in the kitchen 1 hour a day. 2, she will come to his house for tea. Julia doesn't really know etiquette, and besides, she can't say a word. She's afraid he'll be bored with her. When she arrives in the garden, she sees the Duke, a table and 2 chairs. He invites her to join him, and she is a little surprised, pleased, and puzzled. She blushes, and the Duke asks why. The girl promised to take the prince's secrets to the grave, thinking that she would go there soon enough, but the boy said he didn't really believe her. But if he did, it would at least be less dreary. Julia realizes that Mr. Glenn has noticed her awkwardness. She decides to at least touch the food so as not to seem rude. She drinks her tea and thinks it is delicious, in complete delight. The maid brings a dish of desserts. Julia eats it, and her expression shows that it is the first time she has tasted it. Duke called this tea party an errand, hoping she could relax. He noticed a crumb on her face and decided to remove it. For him, this time was proving to be unexpectedly pleasant. After a while, Glenn is pulled out of his thoughts by one of the servants. He asks if Mr. Glenn is too much for him. The master apologizes and asks what is wrong. The servant says that if his wife is bothering him, it should be dealt with. Glenn agrees with him. He's ready to listen. The servant asks if there is someone named Camille in Marquis's family. He remembers that this is the name of his second son. Glenn is not sure about that and asks the servant if he is sure. The servant doesn't think he's wrong, but decides to check to be sure. Glenn asks if he knows anything about this Camille. The servant replies that he knows almost nothing and that he still hasn't been introduced to high society. Glenn wonders why. He suggests that Camille is not yet of the right age. The servant says it doesn't seem to be about his age. He also says that his older brother, the heir to the family, has not been introduced either. He is 23 years old, and Camille is 20. Glenn says it's unusual that in their years the young people are still out in the world. The servant says it may have been a family circumstance. The Lafayette family traces its history back to the founding of their state. Surely nothing is more important to both the Marquis and his wife than maintaining status. The sooner they introduce the heir to the world, the more stable his position in society will be. Glenn wants to know if the Marquis has a harness. The servant replies that of course there is. After all, he is a descendant of an ancient family. If he's not mistaken, his abilities are related to healing. His eldest son should have inherited this arcana, Glenn says. He fears that the ability may have passed to his second son, Camille. He suggests assuming that the harness hasn't been passed on to his eldest son, but that Camille has it, having no right to inherit it. Glenn asks what would happen then. The servant says that in such a case, the oldest and noblest of the Lafayette family must be in serious trouble. If Glenn's hunch is correct, then by delaying the debut of their sons, the Lafayette couple is trying to preserve the family's dignity in the eyes of others. He knows it's only a temporary measure. He asks Simeon to find out more about this family. Glenn thinks there is something wrong with this family and this girl. Walking with Julia in the park, he wonders what Mr. Camille is doing. After all, she's the only one he can talk to. She can't seriously be thinking about this Camille guy all day long, he thinks to himself as he looks at Julia. He learns that her name is Julia, and that the only one who can hear her voice is Camille. He's probably the one who owns the harness. There's no other explanation. Still, if he could hear her, he wondered why he hadn't stopped the bullying. Ever since he'd first read her thoughts, that was all he'd been thinking about. Suddenly, he assumes something and refuses to believe it. He assumes that Camille knew all about the bullying perfectly well and pretended not to notice. Glenn, as they walk down the path, puts his hand on Julia's head and strokes it. He did not rule out the possibility that it was Camille who had deprived her of the ability to speak. But at that time, Julia was thinking about returning to Mr. Camille as soon as possible. At that moment, he read her thoughts and realizes that she herself wants to return to him. He thinks that once she's recovered, he'll have to let her go. But he promises himself that he won't give her up for anything. He doesn't want her to get hurt again and wants to protect her. He wants her not to remember Camille with warmth. Julia turns to Glenn to herself, thinking he can hear her too. But if she finds out, he thinks she'll hate him because he reads her mind whenever he wants. Some girl was watching their walk from the window. At this time, Camille in a dark robe comes down to the basement. In front of him on the floor, there is a magic circle with a red crystal in the middle of it. He picks it up and puts it in a glass jar with other crystals of the same kind. Glenn and Julia at a picnic. Julia is happily eating a bakery item, smiling and looking at Glenn's face with joy. All the while she is being watched by the same woman from the window. Behind her, a servant girl is chatting. One of them asks the other if Mrs. Suzanne came to see the master today. The other says no, she hasn't been in for 3 months. Say you've even stopped pretending. She says the master became a blank slate for her as soon as he handed over his title to Mr. Point. Miss Suzanne's priorities immediately changed, she says. She's not related to Mr. Glenn, so if he decides to marry, she won't have a chance to take over. The girl bangs her fist on the glass with obvious anger. She already hates this girl next to Gleb because he's never touched a girl as tenderly as he did her. She doesn't understand how she managed to get his attention. She thinks it's because the old man was sick. She realizes he did manage to pass the title on to Glenn. She hasn't enjoyed the luxurious life of Duchess Vestris enough. The girl wondered what she had been chasing the old man for so long. She couldn't contain her joy when that woman finally died, but it was her mistake. If Glenn still shunned women, there wouldn't be a problem, she thinks. As long as the client is single, the Vestris belongs to her instead of the landlady. The girl is very angry. She doesn't realize what's happened in the meantime. She promises herself it's not going to happen. She opens the doors with a bang and walks down the hallway, saying she's going to kick that girl out of here. She thinks she's the only one in this house. I come down the stairs and she screams at the Glenn. He calls her mother and says she's his guest. He asks them to say hello. She realizes that ignoring the Duke's guests is like insulting him. Susanna realizes that he must not be turned against himself. She changes dramatically in her face and greets Julia with a sweet face, saying she is glad to see her in their home. Julia bows. If Glenn orders the whole backside like a duke, she can't help but obey. Suzanne is still thinking how to get rid of this girl. She goes to her room, throws pillows all over again, and says she's annoyed by everything. She doesn't understand why she should grovel before some nameless simpleton. Still, she can't get rid of her thoughts to get rid of Julia. Suddenly, something occurred to her. Glenn didn't show much interest, so she completely forgot. She has the perfect idea. She takes a sheet of paper and a pen and writes something. The letter is read by some girl with pink hair and a gorgeous dress. She realizes from the letter that Glenn first avoids all people indiscriminately and then has the nerve to bring some girl to their estate. Glenn is communicating with his servant. They all know that Gregory's arcana is named Curse, while Camille's arcana is Liberation. He doesn't want to rely solely on the document that says it all. The servant says he is sorry, but there is very little information on the matter. Client says it's no big deal. He says it's not his fault that the Lafayette brothers don't appear in public. Gregory's arcana raises definite questions, but there is even more suspicion about Camille's ability. The servant asks why that is. Glenn suggests that Julia's inability to speak is due to his curse. But then Camille's arcana should have broken it and brought back Julia's voice once and for all. He knows that next to Camille, Julia is speaking again, but that doesn't remove the curse as such. He thinks that this ability is only temporarily disempowering him. The Lord wonders if such an arcana could exist at all. The arcana on the Marquis is a healing ability. However, it is limited in what it can do. It is important to note that recently the health of the Marquis has been deteriorating, and he almost does not appear in public. But he still refuses to present his heir to the public. This is what a man who puts his family and his blood above all else would do, says Glenn. He realizes that something is definitely wrong. However, he can't understand it and wants to keep Julia out of danger, but he knows almost nothing. At this time, 2 servants and Julia enter the room. The servants say that the tea is served exactly as Julia. Glenn blushes a little and admires. He assumes she was helping the gardener today, and he let her pick the bouquet. Immediately after his thoughts, he sees a lush bouquet of pink roses in her hands. One of the servants says that since he is partial to flowers, Julia wanted to take them to his study. Hearing these words, Glenn is surprised that this is the first time he has heard that he is partial to flowers. At least that's what Julia thinks. The servant says they don't walk in the garden every day. The man agrees and says that Julia likes it. Suddenly Glenn hesitates and asks the servant how he knows all this. The servant replies that it is of course from Julia, and she has explained it all to him with gestures. Glenn knows she's quite skilled at it, so they haven't had any problems with communication so far. Lena wishes they were the only ones who had trouble communicating. Glenn's face looks downcast and sad. The servant begins to laugh, and Julia looks at him with incomprehension. Suddenly, Julia catches the Clay's gaze and is embarrassed. Suddenly, the girl leaves the room. The servant says that she is not finished with her duties, so he says that their tea party will have to be postponed. Already at the door, Julia is glad that Mr. Glenn smiled at her. She was right. He likes flowers after all. As she walks down the corridor, she thinks of something to do before tea, but in the corridor, she notices a maid with a basket of laundry walking towards her. She approaches the maid and gestures to her that she wants to help. The maid thanks her and hands her the basket. Already with a basket of laundry, Julia, walking down the corridor, realizes that the servants of Duke Vestris are quite different and not like those who work at the Lafayette estate. They don't get angry with her. They don't yell. They don't hit her. They are always calm and smiling. She assumes the reason for everything is that she's a guest here. They've even learned to understand her gestures, and Mr. Glenn seems to predict her thoughts. Julia realizes she's very happy here, but she thinks she can't stay here forever because Mr. Camille must be going crazy with worry. If she decides to get close to the servants of the house just because of their kindness, she will betray Mr. Camille. She realizes that she disappeared so suddenly and that she probably doesn't know what to think. She wants to give Mr. Camille a sign that she is all right, but she is so afraid to go back. Still, she wants to see Mr. Camille. She realizes she has to be brave for him. He cared for her, and he said he liked her. She sits down on the ground and starts to cry. At the same time, a girl's voice comes from behind her. A girl comes up to her and starts calling her names. She asks if she was picked up by Mr. Glenn. Julia looks at her with incomprehension and has stopped crying. Julia thinks she is very beautiful. From the first glance, it is clear that she is an aristocrat. She starts to bow down a lot. She thinks that she has been picked up like a dog and is furious that she has the nerve to think that she can stay here as long as she likes. She's left to figure out if she really thinks Glenn's kindness is boundless. Julia thinks she's just taking a chance that a girl will hit her hand with her heel. She says that nameless vagrants like her don't belong here. She keeps hitting her, and this time she's hit in the head. Julia thinks that Mr. Glenn should not have spoiled her so much, and now he is in trouble because of her. The girl asks Julia to raise her head. She introduces herself and says her name is Ophelia de Arcadia. Julia realizes that's the name of the kingdom. Only members of the ruling family have that name. She realizes that the princess of the kingdom of Arcadia is standing before her. Ophelia declares that Glenn is her future husband. She says that since Julia is sticking it to him, she asks him to remember that it won't cost her anything to kill someone like her. The girl asks Julia if she understands what she is getting at. Julia nods affirmatively. Ophelia asks her to say thank you for her indulgence. But Julia did not listen to her at that moment and kept thinking that she would become Mr. Glenn's wife. He has the title of Duke, and of course he already has a fiancé. She doesn't understand why her heart is so heavy at this moment. A maid comes running to her and asks what's wrong, because she fell. She offers to quickly treat all the abrasions that Ophelia has left her. As the maid leads her by the hand, she is once again convinced that the people at Vestris Manor are very kind, so she doesn't want to cause them any more trouble. Glenn's attendant servant thanks the driver for taking the girl into his carriage. Sitting in the carriage, Julia realizes that even if she leaves here, she will not be able to return to the Lafayette estate. Even if she goes there, the landlady won't let her stay there. She really wants to see Mr. Camille, but she's afraid to go to that house again. Glenn arises loudly upon learning that Julia has suddenly disappeared. He asks what that even means. The servant says he is sorry and says that all the servants have been ordered to look for her, but there is no word yet. She was last seen by one of the maids who told him about it. He asks her if she saw anything suspicious. The maid says that in fact, she had an abrasion on her. Glenn is very surprised. When she ran into Julia, she was sitting in the garden, staring into the void. She had scratches on her forehead and near her nose, so she immediately rushed to treat them. The maid asked if she had fallen, and she just nodded. But the thing was that she thought it was a bit strange. The The point was that if she had fallen, she really could have injured her face, but the back of her hand was also injured. You don't get that early in a fall. It's like her hand was crushed by a heel. Glenn thinks Ophelia did it all. He's a duke now, and doesn't think she'd risk openly going against his will, but Ophelia showed up unexpectedly today, and here she is already able to expel anything. He accuses her that because of her actions, Julia has run away at this time. Julia has already arrived in the city and got out of the carriage. She hears strange noises coming from the house and abruptly moves away from it. Frightened by what she sees, she runs away and meets a man on her way. He tells her to watch where she's going. When he sees the silent girl in front of him, he realizes that there are young people here too. The man confesses that he goes to a brothel, not to sleep with girls from the street, and it pisses him off that they are always so dirty. He takes Julia by the hand and drags her somewhere. Julia is afraid that he's taking her to a brothel. She starts to pull away. Suddenly she hears someone shouting her name from the street behind her. It turned out to be Camille, who had knocked down the man. Tears appear in Julia's eyes. She is happy to see him. At this time, Glenn finally went into town to find Julia. He doesn't know where she might have gone. Julia meets Camille in tears. He approaches her and gives her a chance to speak. He assumes that she must have been really scared, saying that everything will be okay now. Camille comes closer and puts his arm around her. She asks, "What about the man who just hit you?" Camille confesses that he was a little rough, but the blow was not too hard, and he will recover. He says that they better get out of here as soon as possible, because when he wakes up, they will be in trouble. Camille grabs Julia in his arms, but she says she can walk on her own. The camera notices that she is shaking and tells her so. Julia tries to say something, but Camille interrupts me and says that he will not protect her. As they leave, blood gushes out of the downed man's head. As Julia and Camille ride the horseback, the gentleman asks where she has been all this time. He says that when she was kicked out of the lesser, she was seriously injured. However, she is now wearing clean and new clothes, and her wounds seem to be completely healed. Julia tells him that it was fortunate that she got to Duke Vestris's estate. Camille interjects with a confused look on his face. Julia says he found her on the road and took her with him, and he was incredibly kind to her. Camille gripped the hilt tighter. He asked her how she'd ended up here, since the Vestris estate was so far away. Julia says she just thought they shouldn't take care of her forever. Camille asks if she left without saying anything to anyone. Julia says she did. She snuck into the wagon of a merchant leaving the manor. She didn't know how to explain why she wanted to leave. Even if she couldn't, she thought they wouldn't let her go. Whether it was because she hadn't even thanked them last. It was a terrible and honourable thing to do. Julia's excuse is that she couldn't stay there any longer, just because the people there were very kind to her. At this time, Glenn had already lost all hope of finding the missing girl. He goes to his servant and asks if they've found anything. He replies that unfortunately they haven't found anything. Glenn is very upset. He remembers his childhood and how some girl used to call him by his name. He thinks that she too has decided to suddenly disappear, just like her. Camille and Julia are already approaching the estate. The girl says that she can get to her wife. Camille replies that she can't go there now, that it's dangerous. Then Julia asks where she should live. She says to herself that she can't sleep where the gentlemen live. Camille asks her to be quiet, saying she has nothing to worry about, except that he wants to avoid all possible trouble. When Camille and Julia were quite in the yard, Gregory saw them. Camille takes his key and unlocks some doors. A pink-coloured magic sign appears on the lock, and they go inside. They, as Julia recognized, went into some dark stone room. Julia asks where they are. Camille goes through her hair gently and puts a chain around her neck. Julia does not understand what has happened. Camille at the same time says that it is beautiful and kisses her on the forehead. He says that what is dear to your heart should be hidden where it will not be found. Julia's face is clearly frightened. Already bound, Julia lies on the bed with her eyes closed. Camille enters the room. He says the girl was well behaved. He brought her some soup and started to feed her himself. Afterwards, he praises her for eating it all and asks her if it was good, while wiping her mouth with a napkin. Camille embraces Julia and says that he loves her and only her. He asks about her feelings, to which she responds positively to him, saying that she loves him. Camille is very happy and hugs the girl again. Suddenly, Camille says that tonight he will draw a bath and wash her. Her resin curls are extraordinarily beautiful, so he wants to take extra special care of them. He also says that her skin needs care too. He tells her that he recently bought a rose oil that he thought would suit Julia, and is sure she will like the oil. He says that there is nothing else to worry about, because he loves only her, and she doesn't need anything else. In the meantime, a furious Gregory, having learned that Julia has been found, goes around the estate and beats everyone up. He has seen her with his own eyes, and knows that Camille has brought her with him. It's been a few days since then, but Gregory doesn't understand why no one has found out about her. Doesn't understand why she's nowhere to be found. It's like she's disappeared into thin air. Gregory begins to speculate about her whereabouts, his idea making him laugh. He tells himself that Camille is no different from him, that he is a monster. He wants to figure out where Camille hides his toys. Julia is still lying tied up in bed. She wonders how long it's been since she was locked in here. She doesn't even know if it's day or night. She can only guess what time it is by the fact that they bring her food and that Mr. Camille comes by to say goodnight. Julia does not understand where the kind Camille she loved so much has gone. She wants to understand what could have changed him like that. Suddenly, she hears the sharp sound of a door opening, and she hears a joyful voice. She realizes that the voice belongs to Mr. Gregory. Upon seeing the girl, Gregory assumes that Camille has realized that dolls are meant to be played with. The man approaches the girl and lifts her head, holding Julia by her long dark hair. He then releases the girl's hair and hovers over her. Leaning into the girl's face, Gregory asks if he should release her. Julia did not understand what the young man was saying, but the man only added, saying that everything depends only on her, and if she is a good girl, he will save her. The man removed the blindfold from the girl's face. Julia realized that she wanted to get out, but she had to be sure that Gregory would not try to force her into intimacy. Besides, the girl knew that Camille loved her despite bringing her to this strange place. If she accepted Mr. Gregory's help, she would be cheating Mr. Camille's trust. The blonde-haired man continued, telling the girl to at least nod if she couldn't speak. Determined to taunt Julia, he told her to scream for help. At that time, Camille stood behind the ajar door and watched what was happening. When Camille saw what his brother was doing, he pulled him by the scruff of the neck and took Gregory by the throat. The frightened brother didn't understand how the man was there, because he wasn't supposed to be there. Then the boy said he saw the murdered maid on the doorstep, and that couldn't stop Camille. Then he added that for a while Gregory had been very useful. He was very easy to control and cover up. Angry at his brother's words, Gregory decided to wound him with a spear, but Camille intercepted the weapon and wounded his brother. The man said that the boy had no mind at all. If he had not desired Julia, Camille would have let him live longer. The blonde-haired boy said he wanted his brother to regret what he had done, to be consumed by despair. Holding his brother with both hands, Camille said that if Gregory lasted long enough, he would spare him. Julia thought Mr. Gregory looked like he was screaming, but for some reason he didn't make a sound. Grabbing the chain that was attached to the girl's neck, Camille pulled her to him, saying that the girl had seduced his brother. The man asked what she was trying to accomplish, after which he put forward one of his conjectures, asking if she was trying to escape from the Lord in this way. Julia remained silent. Because of this, Camille decided that in that case he should punish her. Camille asked the girl why she doesn't realize that he loves her. After hitting Julia, the man asked why she was behaving so disgustingly. The girl wanted to explain herself, but the young man did not stop beating her, asking that question again. The man asked why she was acting this way despite his love for her. He thought she didn't love him. In a quiet voice, Julia replied that she did. She was afraid of Camille. There was no one but the master for her, so she said she would not run away because she loved him. The girl wanted the man to stop hitting her. Camille was happy with her answer. Julia looked at the man's face, hoping that he would not hit her anymore. The guy said he needed to treat the girl's wounds. He didn't want to leave scars on her pretty face. Noticing that the dress was also soiled, Camille realized that the girl needed to be changed. Untying her hands, the man gave the girl some clothes. The boy told her to wash herself before she put on clean clothes, and he would prepare everything in the meantime. Julia turned to the man, asking him to treat Mr. Gregory's wounds. The young man's gaze darkened. He asked why she would do that, when she had recently sworn that there was no one but Mr. Camille for her. The girl said that she was asking for it precisely because she loved a man. The boy did not understand what Julia was saying. The girl explained that Mr. Gregory was the heir to the Duke of Lafayette. If something happened to him, suspicion might fall on Mr. Camille. If the man was blamed for his brother's injuries, Julia would not stand for it. Only Mr. Camille and Mr. Gregory know that the girl is locked in that room. If something happens to both of them, she will never get out of there. The girl added, saying that she was not asking for Gregory's sake, but for her master's. The man asked if the girl really thought only of him, to which Julia replied that if something happened to Mr. Camille, she would not survive. The girl realized that because of this, she might never see the sunlight again. So Julia said she would do anything. The girl's words pleased the gentleman. He turned to his brother lying on the floor and brought his hand to his face. Afterwards, Camille said that no one must know about Julia and the room. The long-haired guy also told his brother to stay away from them, and if Gregory disobeyed, Camille would kill him in the most brutal way his brother could imagine. Julia thanked the gentleman. The girl turned to Camille and hugged him. Crying, the girl said that she loved him very much. A dark-haired boy runs up to the white-haired man asking what's wrong. Then the man asks if the young man has received a letter from the Duke of Lafayette. Julia lay with her hands bound again, pondering how it could have happened that Mr. Gregory had lost his voice as soon as Mr. Camille touched him, and when the man touched a second time, his voice returned. Mr. Camille's arcana only temporarily weakens illnesses and curses. The girl was told it was not very strong. Mr. Camille can only temporarily restore Julia's voice. He can't cure her completely. Julia realized that she had probably been tricked. She wondered what if Mr. Camille's harness was acting differently. What if he was capable of more? Could the young man have stolen her voice? The girl dispelled these thoughts. She thought that Camille would not have acted there. Mr. Camille, for as long as Julia has known him, is certainly not capable of such a thing. The blonde-haired woman was telling the servants to replace the painting with something in light colours and to get a new carpet. Everything should be in harmony and tasteful, she said. And you also need to make sure that the best room in the southern part of the mansion is in perfect condition. Everything must be spotless, so that there wasn't a speck of dust anywhere. Camille didn't understand his mother's agitation, so he decided to ask the servant. The girl replied that a special guest was due to arrive. The master was also preparing for the meeting, and also the servant said that the master's father wanted to talk to the young man about something. Camille realized that with his father's deteriorating health, he rarely left the room, and now he was preparing to welcome a guest. The lord didn't understand what was going on. Entering his father's chambers, the boy said that he had heard about a special guest. Camille asked what he could do to help, to which his father replied that he and his brother should behave appropriately. The Duke asked his son not to disturb him and his guest. Mr. Camille did not realize who could be such an honored guest. Opening the doors wide, the dressed-up father and mother of the sons welcomed the guest, saying that they were happy to host him. Duke Vestris said that he was the one who was happy to be their guest. Camille could not believe that all this time they had been waiting for Duke Vestris. The man remembered the girl's story that she had gotten into Duke Vestris's estate. He had found her on the road and taken her with him. He was very kind to Julia. Camille was frightened, assuming that the man was looking for a girl, after which he quickly left the balcony, from which he was watching what was happening. The Duke noticed the young man. Hitting the door hard, it opened with a heavy slam. The gentleman started yelling at the girl, taking her by her dress. He asked what the girl had done. Due to the man pulling the girl by the top of her dress, it ripped, exposing the girl's breasts. The guy did not stop. He felled the girl while she asked him to stop. Duke Vestris did not know where to begin the conversation. He had heard rumours that the Marquis Lafayette was ill. He's really gaunt. The Duke wants to get any clue about that girl, except the Marquis treats his servants like animals. If Vestris asked Lafayette about the maid, he might not remember she existed. But she couldn't hide so well without help, and there was nowhere to go but Lafayette Manor. It would be enough for the Duke to know that the girl was well, and that she was happy. If she wished to stay with Camille, the Duke would not interfere. Vestris turned to Lafayette, noting that his lordship's health left much to be desired. Duke Vestris thanked the man for still taking the time to see him, despite his well-being. Lafayette replied to the young man, saying that the Duke was a dear guest of their estate, and the man couldn't help but accept the boy. The man's illness is not so terrible, you might say, just an unnecessary anxiety, and it is not worth the young man's attention. Duke Vestris asked what was so disturbing to Lafayette. The man said that the young man must be aware of the phenomenon of the disappearance of the harness. Duke Vestris was shocked by what he heard. He said he'd heard of people losing control of the arcana because of age or illness, but when a man looked at the young man, it didn't seem so strange. In his case, cause and effect had been reversed. One day, Duke Lafayette's harness started disappearing for no reason, and to date he can't get it to work, and it's not his age or illness that's to blame. He got worse after the harness started failing. In Lafayette country, a harness is undeniable proof of a family's antiquity. The Marquis could not bear the shame of losing his harness. Duke Vestris interrupted the man, saying he had forgotten himself. He asked the Duke not to worry. Since the young man is still young, he can't speculate on the cause of what happened. Vestris didn't understand how the harness could disappear. He always thought it was impossible. But it turned out that it was possible to lose an arcana. The boy said he would look for something in his family's library. Vestris, one of two ducal families that have served the state since its founding. Only the royal family has had their harness longer. He may be able to find information that will help the Duke of Lafayette. The man was glad that the young man had decided to help him in this situation. The Duke thanked the boy. Vestris didn't understand why it was so important to the man. The bloodline, the purity of the blood, the outstanding ability. The young man thought Lafayette was pathetic. Before leaving, Vestris decided to ask the man a couple of questions. The first question concerned the arcana of the Duke, and the second, the sons of the Marquis, particularly the second son, Camille de Lafayette. The man's arcana, the miraculous power of words. It refers to a type of spell. The arcana of the firstborn, Gregory, is named Curse and allows him to cast them. The arcana of Camille is a release, a lifting of curses. Neither son has a strong enough ability to inherit the lineage. Vestris pondered. Rumours said that the arcana Marquis could heal, but the essence of the miraculous power of words is broader than just healing, isn't it? Camille's arcana, just as Simeon said, bears the name of liberation. But is it really weak? That contradicts what the guy learned from Julia. Let's say she can't speak because of the curse. Camille's weak ability works only for a while. That is, it does not cure the girl forever. The boy doubted that the Marquis would lie under the circumstances. But anyway, the hardest part is over. The Duke endured the dinner with those nasty people. He came here under the pretext of a social visit, but he didn't think it would be such torture. You can't tell from their servants either. They're all so lifeless. It's like going to a funeral. Even if Julia decided to stay with Camille, it would be hard for her to be happy in a place like this. It's only a matter of time before she gets beaten up again. Vestris thought it would be enough for him to know she was safe. Most likely Julia was just afraid to come back to him. But even so, she certainly wouldn't stay here. As he waited for nightfall, the man realized it was time. Vestris said it was time to find Julia. The boy decided to look for the servant Alia first. The young man stopped when he heard the servants talking. The girl was saying that one of the maids was pissing her off because she didn't do her job and was thinking about God knows what all the time. And every time Mr. Camille is around, he's stripped down to nothing. Disgusting. The second servant complimented by saying that Julia was also disgusting, but she was better compared to Ari. Hearing the conversation, the Duke realized that the servants knew Julia. The guy noticed a door, which turned out to be a service entrance. When he went in, he saw a girl sitting on the floor, covered in slop. The girl said that all of them are scum. That's why Camille would never smile at them. She said everyone would end up in the playroom someday, but not her. Mr. Camille will take care of her. He's always looking at her. For example, today, he looked towards the girl and smiled. The girl said she was different, not like them. After saying those words, she laughed eerily. The young man remembered the words of the Duke of Lafayette, that Camille's kindness would come back to him someday. He did not look like an aristocrat at all. He could not pass by the wretched and destitute. It seems like the servants really idolize Camille, but this servant girl was like she had lost her mind. The young man realized that there must be servants there too. The Duke heard a scream. Turning around, the man saw the girl. She was begging Mr. Gregory to forgive her. The maid asked Gregory not to take her to the playroom. She said she would do whatever the man ordered. Gregory didn't listen to the girl, only shouted for her to shut up. The Duke didn't like this whole situation. Smiling madly, one of the Duke of Lafayette's sons said that livestock that would do anything for its master belonged in the playroom. The girl was not in the least frightened. She began to scream louder and ask for help. The Duke realized that this was a rotten place. Every day, those in whose hands the power was in exploited those who didn't have it. Vestris didn't understand how Julia was able to keep her good heart under such conditions. She was quite close, but the boy didn't protect her. He's the one who let Ophelia beat her, and now he's come to save her. The young man thought she was going to laugh in his face, but it's better than her staying here. Much better. The boy couldn't find any trace of her. Vestris realized that it was foolish to think that if he broke into the mansion, he would surely find some clues. He thought it was more likely that she was right here. But what the Duke hadn't considered was that she could be in a completely different place. The boy turned his attention to the window, from which golden hair, a distinctive feature of the Lafayette family, was visible. The man in the robe approached the antique clock, turned the hand, and the shelf advanced from the clock. The Duke was shocked by what had happened. When the man left, the young man climbed into the room where the clock stood. Vestris realized that the clock was hiding some kind of mechanism. If you turn the hand to midnight and press the image of the Lafayette coat of arms, and then inserting the key that was in the pull-out shelf into the hole in the wall would open a secret passage. As he descended the stairs, the Duke came upon a door. Opening it, he saw a pentagram. The man heard some kind of sound. Looking at the floor, he saw red-coloured pebbles that glistened from the burning light. Picking up one of them, the Duke thought it was a ruby. But the young man realized it was not a ruby. The liquid dripping from the ceiling had turned to stone. Vestris thought for a moment. The man with the golden hair was clearly not the Marquis, nor his eldest son, Gregory. The Duke remembered Lafayette's words about how his harness had once started disappearing for no reason. The young man already knew that something strange was going on in the Lafayette family. That's why it's probably Camille's doing. The guy would like to figure it out for himself, of course, but he doesn't have a convenient excuse to linger there, so for now it's best to stay a bit out of the way. The conversation with the Marquis yielded little to the young man. The rooms of the Marquis and his family were located on the 3rd floor. The boy went up there, but still couldn't figure out who belongs to which one. Even if he was the Duke of Vesteris 3 times, he could not let himself be noticed. The search only seems to be getting more difficult. If the young man had anything, even a single clue to Julia's whereabouts, the boy would be happy. But since that was not the case, he would have to change his approach to a rougher one. He wondered what Simeon would have done in his place. The Duke realized that for the sake of this girl was really worth the risk, so he would start now. Vestris said that the meeting had been very pleasant. Then the Marquis and his wife replied that they would be glad to see him again. The Duke promised to stop by later. Camille was watching from the window. His expression was calm, and his gaze was cold. As soon as the carriage with the Duke began to drive away, the expression on the gentleman's face changed to a smile. A joyful man came to Julia, saying that Duke Vestris had left, after which Camille asked if the girl was disappointed, after which the man told the girl to confess what kind of things she had said to Duke Vestris. First, the young man picks up a dirty maid from the street as if by accident, and now he is running around trying to find her. The master asked if the girl thought it was strange. Julia said she had not told him anything about it. She wouldn't do that, and she has nothing to hide. There's only room in her life for Mr. Camille. She loves him, so she asks him to believe her. The man says she's right. The girl belongs only to him. Camille was pleased that she reciprocated his feelings. Julia repeated that she loved only the gentleman. The man said that the girl was sweet, the sweetest in the world. The girl again told about her feelings. Then the gentleman answered her in the same way. Camille said he would leave to prepare a bath for Julia, as her body needed to be kept clean and her beautiful hair needed care. The man complimented by saying that a new dress would also come in handy. Leaving, the gentleman told the girl to behave herself. Vestris, who had pretended to be the new servant after pretending to leave, entered the manor. He would now know exactly which room belonged to Camille. When the gentleman came out of there, the Duke decided to take the opportunity to observe. Glenn realized that he definitely didn't want to follow the man any further and that he had to hurry. Camille could return at any minute. The Duke touched the black fireplace that stood in the Lord's room, and it moved away, revealing a secret room. The sight that opened onto the room shocked the Duke. Julia was lying there. She heard that the door had opened because she began to talk about how she loved only Mr. Camille. Vestris ran up to the girl, embraced her, and told her that she did not need to repeat these words. She was hurt, she was scared, she was suffering, and now, if she wanted to, she could scream about it. The man said there was nothing more to be afraid of, for he would protect her. Julia realized that Mr. Glenn was in front of her. The Duke apologized for being late and said he had come to save her. The girl cried, pressing herself even more against the man's chest. He wished he could tell her that she was no longer in danger, but unfortunately he couldn't. Glenn said he had snuck in here on the sly, and he didn't know when Camille would be back. They need to leave as soon as possible. Vestris asked if Julia was able to walk. She said she could, but she was wearing a collar. The Duke said that was no problem, pulling out a dagger. In one motion, the chain from the collar was broken. When the couple had gone outside the room where Julia was, the Duke asked if Camille had said anything before leaving. The girl told him that he had gone to prepare a bath and clean clothes for her, so she did not think it would take long. Glenn said that no one but Mr. Camille and Mr. Gregory knew he was here. Mr. Camille always brought the things he needed by himself. Since he's being so careful, he could very well be delayed. That's good for them. The man said that if the girl wrapped herself in a sheet, she would be harder to recognize. The Duke asked the girl to trust him. He would definitely get her out of here. The former maid wrapped herself in the sheet, covering her eyes. Julia said that Mr. Camille had changed a lot. He became frightening. The girl asked Glenn to keep out of the man's sight. If something happened to the Duke, she would be there forever. Vestris said that everything would be fine. The boy wondered if the girl would tell him her name if they got out. Thanks to the Duke's harness, he could hear thoughts, so he already knew it. But he would like the girl to tell him her name herself. The guy along with the girl in the sheet rode up to the carriage on horseback. There was a servant standing near the carriage who was worried about the Duke. He was afraid that something would happen to the man. Not only had he broken into someone else's estate, but he had also kidnapped a servant girl. Even a duke wouldn't get away with something like that. Glenn said that he knew it himself, and that the servant might not repeat it. The man's words surprised the servant, and then he said that after that, he could not help but worry. The Duke suggested that they go back to his estate and talk there. Mr. Camille sees the empty bed and realizes that the chain was thin, but Julia would definitely not have the strength to break it. The girl shouldn't have escaped. Camille didn't understand why the girl wasn't there. No one but Gregory knew she was there. Camille didn't understand if it was his brother's doing. No, he would never have the courage. The Lord could not understand who had helped the girl. The man remembered, before he left, he had left her a voice, and now she could talk to anyone. Camille didn't want this to happen. Out of jealousy and anger, he tore the pillow, saying he would kill anyone who spoke into his Julia. Anyone who touched his Julia, anyone who looked at her, the one who stole her from him, he would kill everyone. The girl had a fever that would not go away at the Vestris manor. Julia was sick as soon as she was brought to the manor. Apparently, as soon as she felt safe, her exhaustion made itself felt. The Duke wondered what the girl was dreaming about. In the dream, Julia saw Camille in the form of a child, who said that everything was fine. After a grown-up gentleman appeared, who told her that he loved her. Frightened, the girl began to run away and call Glenn. Julia immediately found herself in a clearing with flowers and a bright blue sky. There she saw a woman and a boy she didn't know. The girl immediately realized that they were of noble blood, and the boy looked like Mr. Glenn. The boy handed Julia a daisy. At this time, Duke Vestris was applying a cold towel to the girl's face. He wanted Julia to be safe, but bringing her to the Vestris estate was the best solution. He couldn't protect the girl from Ophelia, and it's not safe here either, at least not for Julia. The man froze. Julia's eyes began to glow. He couldn't be wrong. It only happens during the manifestation of an arcana. There were no exceptions. The man couldn't believe his eyes. The arcana is hereditary. It is only possessed by members of the royal family and only a few noble families who have served the crown for centuries. The arcana awakened by a mere servant girl is simply impossible. The girl asked what Glenn was talking to his father about, but the boy only replied that it was none of the girl's business. Approaching the young man's father, she asked what they were talking about, but the man would not tell her about it. This infuriated the young lady. She began to complain that Glenn had brought some strange girl to the manor. The man shut Suzanne up by telling her that Glenn was the head of the Vestris family. And the man doesn't care what your reasons are. He won't let a girl cross the Duke. Susanna said she wasn't trying to cross him, but her father interrupted her, saying that since she wasn't happy with the decisions Glenn was making, she could get out of here. She was annoyed that the servants were also silent, as if they had water in their mouths, and even the man refused to speak. She could not understand what was going on. When she left her father's room, she said to herself that she didn't like it. She was the mistress of the estate. The servant turned to his lordship, telling him that his guest was awake. The man burst into the girl's room. Noticing Glenn, she called his name with a smile on her face. The Duke asked the girl how she was feeling. Julia said she was very sorry. She slept for 4 whole days. The man said there was no need to apologize. Glenn asked the girl again about her well-being, to which she replied that she was already fine. The servant approached the Duke, alerting him to the doctor's visit. Vestris asked Julia if she remembered what they had talked about before they escaped from Lafayette Manor. The girl said she remembered. The Duke reminded her that she had promised, then asked if she would tell her name to him. The girl didn't remember anything until her 12th birthday, so she doesn't know her real name either, but everyone calls her Julia. Glenn was glad he finally recognized her name. The servants, meanwhile, were talking while standing in the hallway. The man tried to ask the girl if there were any effects from the arcana manifestation. The maid said that she hadn't noticed anything like that yet. The man said that it was difficult to determine what the ability was at this stage. In the period when a person has just acquired the arcana, he does not yet have control over it, and it is not uncommon for him to harm his own physical and mental health. The maid said she would continue to watch Julia closely, and also make sure she doesn't notice it. The man added that it would be very difficult if her arcana got out of control. Only those with the blood of royalty or other ancient bloodlines have the arcana. The fact that the ability had awakened in the girl could only mean that she belonged to one of them. The man wondered. Glenn had recently visited his father. The man didn't know what they had talked about, but he could easily guess. Everyone wondered who the girl was. Vestris wondered if all was quiet at the Marquis Lafayette estate. The servant said that as far as they could tell, nothing was going on. Camille will never sit idly by when he realizes that Julia has been stolen. The servant said that because the Duke was staying at the estate just before the girl disappeared, all suspicion would fall on him. But the second son of the Lafayette family could hardly accuse the young man openly. They have nothing. There is no position or authority to go against the Duke of Vestris. That's why they must take precautions. Camille has neither the title nor the necessary authority, so he can't attack head-on. But that only means that he will use every means possible to get Julia back. The Duke ordered the servant to keep his guard up, after which he told him to take a short break. Entering the girl's room, the man immediately smiled. When asked about her well-being, Julia said that she is already feeling much better. She even felt guilty about lying in bed all day. Then Glenn offered her a short change of scenery. Having thrown a light shawl over the girl, the Duke took her in his arms. The man said that first they should take everything they needed. Opening the doors, to which the young man brought the girl, Julia saw a lot of jewellery, shoes, dresses. She asked who it was all for. To the girl's question, the boy said that it was all for her. The girl started talking about how it was all too expensive. For someone like her, a simple servant girl. The man reminded her that she didn't remember who she was until she was 12. Then he said that perhaps the noble lady sitting in front of him was actually a noble lady. The girl said she didn't think so. The Duke said he didn't care who she was. He will take care of her no matter what her background is. He does it simply because he feels like it. She doesn't need to worry about that. Glenn wondered how Julia would look in nice clothes. So he asked her to show him. The maids immediately began to change the girl's clothes. Seeing the result, the man said that the girl was beautiful. After that, he offered her to drink tea. Sitting at the same table, the man brought a brownie up to the girl's face. Taking a small bite, the girl smiled, as did the man. After that, both of them became embarrassed. Julia wondered what she should do. She was happy, very happy, but she didn't know if she could be here. After all, if she stayed there, she would incur the princess's wrath again. She also wondered what would happen if Mr. Glenn fell out of favor with her because of this. Besides, Camille-san. The girl was worried, what if Mr. Camille hurt Mr. Glenn? What if something happened to Mr. Glenn? It was a dream again. The boy gave the girl the daisy and left, and something incomprehensible began to happen to the girl. The Duke stood over the girl's bed and reflected on the fact that during the day she was full of energy, but at night she was invariably plagued by nightmares. Though it was natural after such a terrible day. The man thought of something he could do for Julia. A couple is riding in a carriage. Seeing the beautiful scenery, the girl was overcome with delight. Glenn told the girl that this place is the most beautiful in the royal villa of Duke Vestris. The Duke explained the shaking of the carriage by the fact that they were at a decent distance from the capital. If you go from the royal palace or the estate of the Marquis Lafayette, where the girl worked, this place is not so easy to get to. One cannot even enter the property without the Duke's permission. Only servants who can be trusted will be present in the castle. Only Simeon comes for work. That's it. Glenn won't let anyone know that Julia came to this place with him. He had made arrangements so that his father and stepmother would not find out about it either. The girl was embarrassed at this approach to her safety. Noticing the embarrassment on the girl's face, the Duke said that there was nothing the girl could worry about. He would banish all her worries. It seemed to Julia that the kindness of this man knew no limits. The couple had a merry time. They talked while sitting on a bench in the park, sailed on a boat driven by a man with an oar, went clothes shopping, and had a picnic where they admired the sky. In the evening, the couple went to watch the sunset, standing on the seashore. Julia knew that it must not be forgotten that Mr. Glenn was a man of royal circles, and he was someone with whom someone like her could not speak so casually. Besides, Mr. Glenn is the fiancé of Her Highness the Princess. Even if she shouldn't, the girl didn't know what she should do. The Duke asked what the girl was thinking about, to which the girl replied that it was nothing in particular. The man asked again. The girl was confused, not knowing what she should do. She shouldn't be imbued with feelings for him. A couple of days later, the couple was sitting down for a cup of tea. Then, Vestris decided to ask what was bothering the girl. All these days, the guy had been picking up on her absent look. He wanted her to speak up if something was bothering her. Julia asked, "What worries could we be talking about?" She had never been treated better than she was now. The Duke walked over to the girl and gently took her by the chin and asked why her smile had faded. Her move made no sense if she couldn't smile freely. Glenn asked the girl who she had in mind, assuming it was Camille. The girl didn't understand the question, so she asked again. The Duke replied that if she had questions about how he was doing since she was gone, he would find out. Julia replied that she didn't think about it, not that at all. At least she didn't want to think about it now. She realized that since the day she had come here, she had only had Mr. Glenn on her mind. Mr. Camille, on the other hand, was completely out of her mind. The young man said that if she could forget, it would be much better. Julia said that what she was thinking, why she would regain control of her voice if she didn't have Mr. Camille by her side, wasn't possible to speak. Guy asked if that was really true. The Marquis of Lafayette said that the arcana of Camille has a negligible value, consists in releasing curses. And the girl realized Camille's ability, which consisted in temporarily weakening diseases and curses. In fact, there is a serious contradiction in this point. Julia's voice remained completely unmoved from the age of 12 until today. It remained unchanged, except for the moments when you spent time with it. The girl confirmed the young man's words, and then he continued. The Duke said that if the curse is the cause, then it turns out that after 5 years it has not weakened, not destroyed. It can be said that this curse is very strong. If Camille's curse release arcana were truly negligible, the symptoms of such a strong curse would be impossible to eliminate, even temporarily. Even if each contact could alleviate the symptom a little at a time. If it were really possible, in 5 years the curse would have been removed. But what they have is that when they parted ways with Camille, the symptom completely returned. It was as if the curse was overriding. The Duke said that the original state was probably different. Julia's voice did not return only in moments of being near Camille. It was taken away for the time when he was not around. The girl realized then that Gregory's voice was missing because of the Lord. Glenn added that this conversation is only speculative at this point. No evidence is available. However, the man does not think this point can be called erroneous. The Duke is going to look into the matter further. And the girl in turn needs not to worry and relax. After the young man asked a question about what was more important, if Camille was not the cause of the disappearance of Julia's smile, then what was? Westeros wanted her to tell him. The girl knew it would be hard for her to say it, but she mustn't make him worry. Julia decided to confess, saying that Mr. Glenn was a very busy man, and he could not keep her with him forever. Besides, he is engaged to Her Highness the Princess. She feels sorry when she thinks about the feelings of the heiress. And at the same time, Julia thinks about wanting to be near Glenn for just a little while. The girl has spent so much time thinking only about how long she can stay here. The man interrupted the girl, saying that she was the one that gives him extraordinary feelings. Then Glenn squeezed her in his arms. Concerned about Her Highness's engagement to Vestris, the girl broke from the embrace. Then the young man said he wanted to correct Julia on one thing she had said. The lad said he was not engaged to anyone yet. Then the girl said that she learned about it from Ophelia. The man said that in reality there was no formal engagement. Given the young man's age and position in society, he was probably considered the most suitable candidate, and there might be talk of it somewhere. If the royal family makes a formal offer, it will surely be difficult to refuse, which is probably why Ophelia presents it in such a manner as if everything has already been decided. Despite this, the young man is not her fiancé, at least for the time being. Hearing this, Julia said that in that case, even if she were to be near a man, this time would be enough for her. After that, she asked to be allowed to spend time with Glenn. Westeros realized that this was indeed the girl. They embraced and kissed. Not expecting this, the girl shoved the man away from her. But he explained that, as Julia had said, he was a busy man, and he wouldn't try so hard to find her if he didn't want to spend time with her. Glenn asked the girl just in that instant not to think anymore. Not about Camille, not about the princess. He wanted the former maid to be only his. After saying that, the couple merged once again in a kiss. The man stood at the window. He knew that the young man's position and connections as Duke of Vestris had not disappeared, and despite that, his feelings of love for Julia overpowered everything else. The lad wanted to protect the girl, wanted her by his side. Glenn remembered the girl's words that this time would be enough for her. He thought about it. Julia had said that even a short period would be enough for her, because the young man believed that she feared his position in society. This was annoying. The man understood the young lady's feelings about the whole circumstance, but he didn't want a relationship that implied an end. Knocking, Glenn entered Julia's room. The girl in the dress before him made him stop. He liked the way she looked. Westeros said the girl looked quite beautiful, and he was honoured to enjoy dinner with such a beautiful girl. Glenn wished it wouldn't stop. He wanted to take her with him and run away somewhere far away. But it disregards those who work for the Duke family, those who have sworn allegiance to her, those who reside on her estate, and those who are connected to the Vestris family. Therefore, a man cannot do this. More importantly, even if he did so, Julia would not be happy. Glenn realized that this happy time would end someday. If only it had lasted just a little while. But the devil mocked such paltry pleas. A servant burst into Westeros' room, telling him that the entire family of the Marquis de Lafayette had been murdered. The eldest son, Gregory de Lafayette had been murdered by the Marquis of Lafayette, his wife, second son, Camille, 3 sons and 2 daughters. A total of 7 people were killed. Glenn couldn't believe what he was hearing. Vestris arrived at the Lafayette estate, after which he said he wanted to see the bodies of the victims. The Duke was led to a room where the bodies of the dead were located. One of the knights said that the murder weapon was an axe. The whole family was mercilessly slaughtered, and the second son, Camille, had his face mangled to shreds. The perpetrator, the eldest son, Gregory, is in a separate room. Glenn said he'd check the other rooms first. The young man didn't understand how Camille had been killed. That devious, hiding his immeasurable madness in secret guy. Walking into the room where Julia used to be tied up was empty and clean. No trace of having been there remained. The Duke realized that Camille had been killed after removing all traces of what he had done. He guessed that it couldn't even be like that, and that Camille's corpse was a fake. The boy was led to the room where Gregory was. The boy sat on his knees, laughing hysterically. Lafayette said that was what everyone should do, for they had all put him down for nothing, and now the Lafayette house belonged to him. The Duke addressed the young man, calling him Gregory de Lafayette. Glenn touched the young man, asking if he had killed the 6 men. The second after the touch, Vestris felt fear. Gregory had an intense fear circulating toward Camille. The boy didn't understand how anyone could be so afraid of the brother the young man himself had allegedly killed. Gregory's psyche went downhill, not because of the murder of his family, but because of his feelings of fear for Camille. The Duke was certain Camille was alive. He also had no doubt that the guy was involved in the loss of Julia's memories, and he was attached to her to the extreme. That's why Glenn doesn't think Camille will decide to leave the girl in the past. That meant only one thing. Julia was in danger. His lordship didn't see how he could protect the girl, didn't know what he could do on his part. He always wanted to hide Julia. He wanted her to bloom only for him. 3 months later, the prince gave a ball. There were many people from the noble courts. Ophelia was also present. Glenn came out with Julia, saying he was glad that everyone had come. People did not realize who was standing next to his lordship. Everyone was whispering about how beautiful the young lady looked. Only Ophelia did not understand why the Duke was standing next to that girl. She was angry at the fact that she was not the maid. Walking down the stairs, the pair approached the man with pink hair. Glenn said, "Glory to the young son of the kingdom, His Highness the Prince." The man standing in front of the couple asked who the girl next to the young man was. Vestris said that this girl was someone he loved very much, a partner he intended to marry. The Duke's words angered Ophelia even more. The girl fell into a stupor. At this time, Julia bowed beautifully to His Majesty and said her name. Ophelia couldn't take it. The girl began to shout that the couple's marriage is nonsense. She reminded that Julia is a servant who does the rough work. His Majesty was interested after what his sister had said, so he decided to ask again. Ophelia said that the girl is indeed a servant, and that can't be hidden. And Julia is of inferior origin. She is not even allowed to appear before His Majesty. His Majesty's sister turned to the girl, asking if that was the case. The brown-haired woman said nothing to the young lady, causing her to be confused. Duke Vestris decided to say that with all due respect, this is a big misunderstanding. Ophelia could not believe it, so she began to interrupt the man. Because of the scandal caused by the girl, he said he was going to prove it here and now. People wearing white cloaks who were carrying a magic crystal entered the ballroom. One of those people pulled down the hood of the cloak. The people in the hall immediately realized that it was the Lord High Priest. The people in cloaks approached His Majesty and bowed, saying, "Glory to the young son of the kingdom and the beautiful flower of the kingdom." These words were meant for His Majesty and Ophelia. After that, the cloaked men said that they would also like to welcome the sword of the kingdom, His Excellency Duke Vestris. His Majesty wondered what the ball was for, which was attended with a magic crystal. The High Priest said that His Excellency Duke Vestris had commissioned him to prove that the girl next to him was of noble descent. His Majesty wondered how they were going to do this. The young man asked if His Majesty knew about the magic crystal that one of the men in the cloak was carrying. The man said that it could be used to check the presence of a harness and that he had once touched such a crystal. The man in the cloak replied that His Majesty was right. After that, he asked Mrs. Julia to touch the crystal. His Majesty was shocked. He didn't realize that the girl had an arcana. When she touched the crystal, it started to glow purple in color. Ophelia could not understand what it meant. The high priest said that now everyone could see for themselves, realizing that it was not a trick. His Majesty loudly told everyone that this Lady Julia possessed the harness, so she has either royal blood or old noble blue blood in her. Duke Vastris confirmed His Majesty's words. However, as it happens, she suffered some grief in her childhood years and lost her memory, and for a long time, she was treated unfairly. Recently, because of exhaustion, the girl went blind, and to protect her arcana manifested, people discovered it, and everything was revealed. The people around her were shocked by such tragic circumstances. Glenn continued by saying that under all circumstances she was a kind, affectionate, cheerful servant, conscientious and honest. She was also a hard worker who knew her work well. In those days she had made him feel at ease with her. But when he witnessed the manifestation of her arcana and learned that she was actually of noble descent, he was amazed. Despite the loss of memory, the harsh living conditions and mistreatment for such an origin, she had not lost her precious humanity. The Duke began to talk about how strong and beautiful a soul the possessor had, and how such a thing could fail to enchant. Ophelia didn't understand how things had turned out this way. Glenn said that with his own strength he wants to make Julia happier than anyone else, wants to protect her. Therefore he asks His Majesty to accept their engagement. An enraged Ophelia began to shout that she would not accept. She shouted at Julia, saying that Glenn belonged to her and that the maid was a separatist, and in general, how dare she? Raising her hand at the girl, Her Majesty wanted to hit the young lady. Her hand was intercepted by her brother, telling her to stop. His Majesty apologized for the rudeness of his sister, who tried in every way to get out, after which His Majesty said he did not, shocking Glenn. The man turned to Duke Vestris, asking if they had done well. His Majesty invited the young man to go to the balcony for the upcoming conversation. The Duke warned Julia that he would be gone for a while, and that she should not worry. Afterwards, he told her to stay close to Susanna. Glenn decided that everything was all right. He thought Suzanne didn't like Julia, but as long as that agreement stood, she wouldn't betray him. When he went out on the balcony, His Majesty said he'd had time to dream about being the young man's brother-in-law, and he was sorry. Duke Vestris apologized for not living up to the young man's expectations. His Majesty asked if Ophelia was not to his liking. Then Glenn said that she was the kind of person who was hard to find someone to match. He, like many, is not worthy of her. The man said he liked the young man's words, but he wasn't being honest. Reminding him that there was no one else here, he hoped for an honest answer. The old Duke would have preferred to ask for the hand of Her Highness the Princess, rather than choose a path on which nothing good awaited him. His Majesty asked if the Duke had changed his mind when he met Julia. The boy said he had, all because he loves her. The young man's words made the man laugh. Laughing, he asked if Duke Vestris had chosen love over guaranteed power, gave up the opportunity to become part of the royal family, and made that ardent speech just for love. His Majesty said he didn't think so. Then he asked Glenn what his true purpose was. His Majesty's eye could not deceive him. The young man answered that he was indeed enchanted by her, but as it was said, he called her his bride, and even demonstrated the fact of having a harness. It was all done with another purpose in mind. The Duke's words interested the man, so he asked what it was. The young man said that the purpose was to protect the girl. He didn't think there was really a division between the lowest and the highest. But the reality is that aristocrats and maids are treated differently. The latter can be protected, but there are limits. And if the girl is known as Duchess Vastris, that will be her only shield. Camille was able to imprison Julia because no one will look for one missing servant. However, now he will find it difficult to act, since Julia has become known to the public. For the sake of this, the guy convinces her by explaining about his and her arcana. And he made an agreement with Suzanne, inducing her to cooperate. For 3 months, Julia practiced diligently, and eventually became a proper noblewoman. His Majesty asked what he was trying to protect her from, since they'd gone to such lengths. The Duke decided not to tell everything in brief, saying that from everything. He said he wanted to neutralize anything that could threaten her. The man said he felt like something was still being kept from him. Glenn asked for mercy, not knowing what else he should say. His Majesty said that the Duke's thoughts had nevertheless touched his heart. Information of the harness must always reach them. Father's persuasion would be on the man. Glenn thanked him. His Majesty was interested. He decided to ask if the Duke was happy with the difference from other aristocrats. To be precise, the young man is still green. Glenn hesitated for a moment. The man said he couldn't wait to see how far the lad would go. Leaving the Duke, he realized that he had seen Julia somewhere. Back at the manor, the Duke asked the girl if everything was all right. She answered positively. Julia decided to ask if she had behaved properly. The young man said that she was flawless. Only at the last dance, she was a bit fidgety. Holding out his hand to her, Glenn said he would protect her. She could continue to trust him and follow him. The girl became overwhelmed. She apologized, saying that she should not touch Mr. Glenn's hand directly. The guy asked if she was bothered by his harness. If you touched it, it would look into the head of the touched. He was afraid she would be uncomfortable with it. Julia smiled sweetly, saying that Mr. Glenn's hand was the hand that had saved her, and also the hand that would protect her from now on. If he didn't mind looking into her soul, she would like to touch him. Gently taking her hand, he put his other arm around the small of her back. Hugging Julia, he touched her forehead with his lips. Royal manner. An enraged Ophelia tears a sheet, saying she will never forgive the girl. The Duke of Vestry embraces the girl, saying he'll be sure to protect her. Engagement, not just a way to protect her. He said not to think he had no feelings, and not to say she wasn't ready to settle for what she had now. He said he loved her, wanted her to always be there for him. Releasing the girl from his embrace, he put his gloved hand to her cheek. She turned to him, saying it wasn't through gloves. She asked him to touch her soul. Removing the gloves from both hands, he placed them against her cheeks, leaning his forehead against hers. They were happy. The couple merged in a tender kiss, embracing each other. Julia sat at the tea party. Picking up the cup, she took a sip and placed it carefully on the saucer. The girl sitting in front of her said it was flawless, and she had nothing more to say. She thanked the teacher, calling her Countess Pellerin. The woman said that was correct, and the young lady should call her by her first name. Soon, Julia would receive a whole mountain of invitations, whereupon the Countess asked if the girl was nervous. She said she was nervous, though Mr. Glenn said she was not obliged to be. But since she's the Duke of Vestris's fiancée, she wants to do the right thing. The woman said she understood the young lady's feelings, and yet, high society is a dark forest. The royal palace in particular is full of secrets and mysteries. The girl must not be harmed. As His Excellency says, there is no need to push himself, for he wants to protect Julia. For all that, her manners are impeccable. Still, she should discuss it with her lord, and accept invitations on the basis of importance. That's the Countess's opinion. The young lady thanked her teacher. The girl came to the field where the knights were practicing with Mr. Glenn. Calling to him, he turned around, asking if everything was all right. Julia walked over to the young man and took off her gloves. Taking the guy's hand, she said that Mr. Simeon wanted to see him. Embarrassed, the lad realized how nice Julia was. Glenn asked if Simeon had instructed Simeon to call him for her. The Duke said that in that case, he should say a few words to him. The girl said she wanted to go herself. Mr. Simeon stopped her, but she insisted. She asked not to tell Simeon off. Taking his hand to his face, the boy didn't understand why Julia was so lovely. Taking his hand away from his face, the Duke realized that such a casualness, when a person's origin and position did not matter, was one of Julia's best traits. The Duke told the girl to tell him that the young man would come as soon as he changed his clothes. It was not fitting for the next Duchess of Vestris to be the butler's messenger, but Julia. The girl squeezed the man's hand, saying she was only too happy to help Mr. Glenn. Coming to Simeon, the young man asked why his face was so distracted. Simeon said that His Highness the Prince has made contact. He probably got wind of Madame Julia's identity. Simeon didn't believe his eyes at first either. but it was always important to find arguments to prove the truth of the information first. The Duke asked if they had found them. Simeon said that they probably had. In a week's time he must attend a ball at the royal castle as indicated on the sheet. Glenn wondered if a partner had been designated. Simeon said that the partner was not designated because he believed that he was invited along with the bride, Lady Julia. The Duke said that he thought there was no question of gaining the favour of Her Highness the Princess. Stepping out of the carriage, the servant greeted the woman. She wondered if something had happened in her absence. Suddenly her eyes widened. A man with golden hair was walking ahead. She thought it was Andrew. The guy said it was him. He had a sudden desire to see his aunt. When he turned around, Camille stood in front of her and asked her if she was well. Not realizing that it was not Andrew, she asked if he was troubled. She asked if something terrible had happened to Marquis Lafayette's family. Andrew hadn't been heard from until one day, a month after the incident. The guy apologized. He knew he was causing concern, but he was busy looking for a new job. Because of that, he couldn't make contact. If he lost his job again, after all he had gone through to earn Count Pellerin's trust. The woman asked if he had caused problems for her husband and her. She said that whatever it was, she was glad he was okay. With a hug, she told him to take his time and rest. Andrew Cavalier, third son of the bankrupt Earl of Cavalier. His family was already on the brink of extreme poverty when Johann Cavalier, Andrew's father, inherited the title. Johann, however, loved public attention and luxury, and there was nothing left for him to do but leave the possession of the title. He kicked out his wife and children. He continued to party at other people's expense. His life ended when he was stabbed to death because of debt problems. For the ex-wife, the breakup with her husband became a cause of heartache. His first and second son caught an epidemic and died because of his poor lifestyle. The third son, being very similar to his father, lived happily at the expense of acquaintances, not worrying about his reputation. Camille learned of Andrew's existence 3 years ago. It all began when he arrived at the mansion of the family of the Marquis of Lafayette to beg money from the servants. Despite his lack of money, elementary, for food, he looked brilliant. Even his hair was well done. But above all, they were very similar in character. Camille immediately found out about him and brought him to his attention. Camille sat across from Andrew, saying that he wanted to entrust him with a secret case, the case he had assigned to him, control of Gregory's toy box. This is the name of the room created to satisfy his sadistic craving. He was allowed to do whatever he wanted with the objects there. There were also people whose death would not cause any problems. For someone who had originally lived off the exploitation of people, taking on such a job was a matter of profit. So Camille had a substitute in case of emergencies. Under the pretext of confidentiality, Andrew was forbidden to leave the estate, and he spent his time in one of their luxurious rooms, which was in the same building as the toy box. Andrew lived in abundance. He was even allowed to use Gregory's toys to keep him from running away. 3 years behind the scenes of this theatre, Camille wrote to Aunt Helena that Andrew now had a job in the house of the Marquis of Lafayette. He contacted Johannes Cavalier's younger sister, now Countess Pellerin, introducing himself to Andrew. Through her trust, he has also earned the trust of her husband, Count Pellerin. Helena, who had married the Count before his nephew was born, did not know Andrew well. Johann did not tell him of Helena's existence because he was probably afraid that Helena, his moneymaker, would be taken away from him. Getting Elena's mind was easy. The subtlety of the relationship played into their hands, so Camille was able to easily replace Andrew, got what was needed, removed all the obstacles. It remained only. Yulia comes over to the girls who are sitting having a cup of tea. The red-haired girl asks if this is the girl they are talking about. After which she says that she wondered what kind of person she was. Even if Julia has royal blood flowing in her, in which the harness is hidden, there is no hiding her bad upbringing. Let the former maid make efforts. She still can't compare with Mistress Ophelia. The young lady said it right. Someone like her was no match for Her Highness. The red-haired girl asked if Julia thought she could get away with stealing Count Westries from Lady Ophelia. Julia said she knew everything. They were not officially engaged. The girl was confused, stammering. She mumbled that they weren't officially engaged, but the tacit understanding of it was already there. The former maid smiled sweetly and apologized. After which, she said that she did not know it. She had been badly brought up. Julia said she would ask His Excellency about the state of affairs. It would be wrong to enter into an engagement that ignored the sense of honor that it was necessary to have. The red-haired girl asked, "His Excellency, the Duke of Vestris." The young lady answered the girl's question positively and thanked her for giving her the idea. Blushing with embarrassment, the red-haired girl stood up and left, asking to take her leave. The maid was called by another girl, saying that that girl was in the close circle of Her Highness the Princess. After that, the girl asked if Julia was all right. She said that she didn't take it to heart. On the contrary, she was glad to get a valuable opinion. Julia realized that she had faced far more severe cases. Compared to them, this was nothing special, even though it was true that she hadn't had a good upbringing. However, that didn't mean she had to put up with being looked down upon. That, and for the sake of Mr. Glenn, who wants the best for her. She will not let her being around Mr. Glenn become his weak point. It seems that Julia's identity had been discovered. She had to attend the royal castle in a week's time. Glenn did not initially want to show up at the royal ball with her because he knew she would be criticized by the princess's aristocrats. But given the circumstances, he saw no other option. Miss Julia is approached by a guy in luxurious clothes and pink hair. He apologizes for the rush and asks if he can take Glenn away for a while. Glenn approaches Julia from behind and addresses His Highness. Glenn fears about Julia being left all alone in the royal castle in this case. His Highness catches him thinking and immediately tells him that Ophelia will do nothing about it. Besides, she couldn't attend the ball tonight. Glenn asks what happened. His Highness says she is under house arrest and she and her father had a serious argument. Glenn was greatly surprised. He assumes his father approved of their engagement and she didn't like it. His Highness says it's mere caprice and the harsh truth about her, and says they need to go away for a while. He also warns that he will ask the knights to guard Miss Julia while he is gone. Julia sideways says he can go, and she doesn't mind. Glenn gives her a big hug and asks her to wait just a little while. His Highness is watching the picture and smiles. At this time, in some room, a girl touches the face of a man sitting on the floor with the palm of her hand. The man is greatly disturbed. His Highness brings Glenn into the room and tells him that what he wanted to show is Julia's painting. His Highness says that when he first saw Miss Julia, he thought he had seen her somewhere before. He says it couldn't have been that he met her as a child. Some time ago, he saw the image of her that he sees now, but he only remembered seeing her, and no conversation came to his mind. Then he thought, he must have seen her in a portrait or something. He did a search, relying on his memories, and found this. He asks Glenn if the girl in the portrait looks like Julia, and said that when he found it, he got goosebumps running through his body. Afterward, he asks if Glenn wants to know more. He says that there's no telling how things will turn out if Miss Julia is connected to this girl, and adds that once Glenn finds out, there's no turning back. At this time, Ophelia stands in front of the kneeling people and asks them something. Mistress Julia begins to move. A guard notices this and asks where she is going. Julia says she is going to powder her hair, but the guard offers to follow her and immediately realizes that it would be strange if he followed her to the ladies' room. Then he says he will wait for her outside. Julia promises to go straight back to the place afterwards. There was some guy watching them from around the corner. He recognized Julia. She notices the guy's gaze and immediately rushes out of her seat. She runs down the hallway and the same guy follows her and asks her to stop. Julia doesn't realize what it was. She takes off her heels to make it easier to run. She is followed by several guys with worried faces. Julia doesn't know what's going on, but she knows she has to escape somehow. She notices that there are 2 more guys blocking the passage. She notices that the eyes of these men are not ordinary. She runs the other way and screams for help. At this time, the Duke returns to the hall and notices Julia missing. A guard runs up to him and apologizes. He says that according to what Julia said, she went to the restroom but still hasn't returned. Glenn is clearly frightened. He yells at the guard and asks why he didn't escort her out. Julia has already broken away from the pursuers, but she doesn't understand how to get back. She realizes that she needs to go back to Mr. Glenn's arse or some other crowded place. There had already been many attempts on her innocence, both from the Lafayette family and from Mr. Gregory, and there was still lust in the eyes of the people who approached her with such an attitude. However, it was different with those men. There was no lust in their eyes. It looked like the only thing they wanted was to hurt her. She wondered what Mr. Camille's eyes had been like. He has lied too much to say for sure, but the truth is that although he beat Julia while she was in confinement, he never defiled her. She realizes that guessing about it is useless, and that she cannot understand Camille's aspirations. And now she doesn't need it at all. She won't let anyone else touch her because she is devoted to Mr. Glenn. Walking through the forest, she sees a light. Perhaps there is a way out of it. She realizes she needs to get back to Glenn or go out into a crowded place. She steps out into the square in front of the palace. She realizes that if she walks from here, she will surely get to the hall quickly, and she will figure out the way. Suddenly, she hears the voices of the men she was running away from. They have found her and want to catch her. Tired, Julia starts to run again, but her path is blocked. She does not understand what to do, as there is nowhere else to run. One of the men says that she has made them sweat and pulls his hand towards her. Julia is very frightened and asks them to stop. One of them tells her to shut up, but suddenly all the men change their faces and kneel down in front of her. Julia doesn't understand what is happening. Suddenly she hears Glenn's voice. He hears her scream and asks if nothing is wrong. He sees Julia's arm in abrasions, takes her in his arms and hugs her. Julia loses consciousness. Glenn sees the men kneeling and doesn't understand anything at all. His Highness observes all this and immediately says that it is Julia's harness, just like Ophelia's. He immediately asks if Glenn can smell the sweet odour. Glenn hasn't quite figured out what His Highness is talking about yet. He says it's the scent Ophelia uses to increase the potency of her arcana. Glenn has heard that Her Highness's harness consists of a charm of sorts. The prince says it is, and corrects him, that it is an arcana that controls the mind of the opposite sex. Its ability is not that strong, and so thanks to it, only men can be ruled. Besides, the charms are only succumbed to by those who are favoured by her, are intoxicated, or do not possess arcana and the like, says the prince. She cannot fully control the mind without affecting it with alcohol, flavour, or pleasure. Moreover, this arcana possess only those who have royal blood. It's one of the most powerful because it controls people's minds. Glenn's slowly getting the hang of it. He asks the prince if he means that the princess has gathered men favourable to her and, controlling them, has attacked Julia. The prince says that this is so, but that is not what needs to be taken care of now. Just then, Glenn loudly emerges and declares that this is not something even Her Highness can get away with. The prince asks Glenn to calm down, for in itself, what Ophelia has done is unacceptable, but he offers to look at the state of affairs. The men who were charmed by Ophelia kneeled before Miss Julia. A man who can subjugate people must have royal blood in him. The same arcana of Ophelia, it is weak, but at the same time, thanks to it, it is possible to control people's minds, suggests Glenn. Miss Julia, while fainting, handled Ophelia's harness and also suppressed it. Glenn finally realizes that Julia may have royal blood running through her. The prince then asks Glenn to be prepared, for her defense will not be an easy task. Depending on the situation, the prince says that could also turn out to be his enemy. The prince returns to the castle and goes into Ophelia's room. She's lying on the bed and sighing heavily. His Highness says that the arcana of control has been suppressed by an arcana of greater power. Ophelia wants to appeal to her brother, but he says that their arcana, the royal family's arcana, are not comparable to ordinary arcana. It is a powerful force that has an effect on people. He says that one cannot be careless in its use. He asks Ophelia why she used her powers, for although they are weak, they are still dangerous. The greater the power, the greater in responsibility. The prince slaps Ophelia, who is lying on the bed, hard. She covers her eyes with her palms, weeps, and says that she did not know that such an insignificant girl would dispel her charms in no time. The prince says she is a fool. He asks if she knew that Julia possesses an unknown arcana, the blue blood harness of ancient aristocrats, the arcana of the blood of noble kings. There was a possibility of such a thing. Ophelia tries to say something, but her brother interrupts her and tells her that her power is weak. He says that an arcana of blue blood could handle an ability of her level, and that the world is full of people she can't use her power on. The ability to control the human mind is a powerful force beyond human comprehension. The prince says that despite all this, it is not powerful, and so its use can be dangerous. He says that if the person whose mind she manipulated finds out the reason for it, what will others think of her? The prince asks her to reflect on the fact that the more she uses this ability, the fewer people will be left around her. She realizes this, but even so, she thinks of Glenn. His Highness interrupts his sister and catches her thinking, saying that there is no way she should act alone. He states that if she so desires Glenn, he will give it to her, but that will only be if Ophelia follows his instructions. He says she must be eliminated as soon as possible. A short time later in the Duchy of Glen, a servant approaches the Duke and says that a guest has come to see him. He strokes the face of Julia, who is lying unconscious. He leaves the room and greets the guest. He says he is very grateful for the visit. It was the prince. He had promised to visit Glen, hadn't he? Glen asks His Highness to tell him about the girl in that portrait. The prince says her name is Celestine de Lagrange, daughter of the Marquis Lagrange family, but puts emphasis on the fact that she was supposedly a daughter because the Lagrange family fell apart piece by piece. Another participant enters the conversation. He clarifies that the Lagrange family are traitors. Prince says that to the public they are. Glen asks what he means by that. The reality is that the Marquis family was destroyed because of treason, but the prince says that in reality they are pure. Glen is confused. His Highness suggests we go in order. He points to Celestina. His father, now king of this country, was still a prince when he fell in love with her and kept her by his side. Technically, her position could be called concubine. At that time, the father had already met his wife. The man with white hair says that as far as he can remember, in their country, only kings can have official concubines. The prince says he is right. The stipulation is clear about that. His father, while still a prince, had another girl on the side other than his consort, his mother. He even set aside a significant portion of the royal palace for her and gave her the status of second consort. Glen is very surprised. He asks if it's allowed. After all, according to the rules of their country, it is different. The prince says there is only one girl who can be his wife and queen, to whom he will swear his love before God. This principle cannot be betrayed even by a king. At best, there can be a mistress who holds the official position of concubine. However, this is only a privilege allowed only to the king, says the third interlocutor. The prince says he did, but his father wanted Celestina anyway. And even in society he wished to see Celestina by his side, not his consort. To do this, he needed to make her not a mistress, but a girl with a position to call publicly. But a prince with his status as an official concubine was not yet allowed to have an official concubine, and the desperate measure he decided on was to make her a second consort. Everyone asks if this was against the law. He tells us that his father was cunning Simeon, so nothing of the sort. All because second princess is a job title. It's the same as maid of honor. A new position was created for the Celestina, a second consort, a servant directly subordinate to the prince, who could also be present with him in society. He realized it wasn't her fault, but emotions were taking over, and as much as he loved her, his hatred knew no bounds. Celestina was forced to leave the royal palace, but that did not assuage her father's anger. He branded Celestina's father, the Marquis, as a traitor to the country, and thus destroyed their entire family. Glen slowly realizes what's going on. Celestina's striking resemblance to him, as well as the arcana of mind control. The arcana of mind control are only possessed by people with royal blood in them. He concludes that Julia is the daughter of the late king and Celestina. Simeon turns to the prince. The prince interrupts him and says that he is a truly remarkable man and asks if he needs proof. He replies that yes, he does. The portrait and harness of Mistress Julia alone are enough for a guess. But if they want to treat it as fact, arguments are necessary. The prince takes out some envelopes. They are letters addressed to Celestina, who had left the castle and was the object of his father's hatred. Here he writes about his life, as well as the birth of his daughter. He inherited the royal villa from his grandfather, which stands in the woods east of the palace. Celestina's portrait was there too, and he is sure his grandfather wanted to show it to his son and grandson. Glenn asks where the letters came from. The prince replies that yes, they were hidden in a box, stylized as a book. He has familiarized himself with the text, but here not all the letters are addressed to Celestina. Most of them have been destroyed. Since the dates and content are not consistent, he assumes this was done so they would not be discovered by his father. However, only these 5 letters remain. Simeon assumes something to confirm the identity of Mrs. Julia. The prince says it's quite likely and asks them to read them. Everything they want to hear is in here. Glenn takes a few letters and opens them one by one, reading. There are words of thanks to the late king written there, for secretly providing a home and caring for a life, a peaceful life. Regarding the present circumstances, she wrote that she realized how guilty she was, for she could not give up the absurd position of second wife. Yet she was not offended, for they had done much for her sake. She wished him every good thing, not as a lover, but as a king. With no less hope she spoke of the prince, who was a baby when she left the royal palace. She also mentioned the queen, saying that she went through heartache during the difficult times of the child. She begs the late king to take care of her. Even after getting into an absurd situation due to the whims of men, she wrote words of gratitude. Glenn thinks it's a lovely text. Celestina, like Julia, was a woman with a frankly kind heart. The next letter contained information about the birth of a daughter by the king. Her facial features were an exact replica of her mother. The colour of her eyes resembled the late king's, and they were ruby-coloured. There was also an appreciation there for the name Julia, even if Julia can't take the royal surname Arcadia or Celestine Lagrange's surname. That's why the letters are so determined to make her happier. Julia must choose her own path in life, independent of kinship ties vying for power. She didn't choose her path, but floated on the words of the people around her. She has made many people unhappy because of it, and doesn't want Julia to feel the way she does. She wants to raise a strong child who can make her own way. Glenn realizes that Julia grew up with a pure heart. She was not only very strong, but always bright and happy. Glenn puts the puzzle together. Appearances, arcana, letters, Julia's name. He is left in no doubt. The prince says that Miss Julia is the daughter of Celestina and the late king. Julia is evidence that the one he loved was defiled by his father. To his mother, Julia is the daughter of the woman who stole the heart of her beloved husband. And to society, Julia is the daughter of the cheating Lagrange family. The prince turns to Glenn and asks if he understands him. Circumstances have changed, and they cannot approve their engagement. Glenn begins to object. The prince says that no one will mind if he refuses to marry Ophelia, but choosing Julia to be his bride is unacceptable. He asks Glenn to use his judgment. The duke's loyalty to the king, duty to the royal family, power, wealth and position are at stake. Simeon says that if Glenn chooses Julia, everyone who serves Glenn's family and everyone he has a good relationship with may turn on him, abandon him, humiliate him, flatten him because of Miss Julia's choice. Prince wonders if Glenn realizes this. If so, he'll have to be prepared to be branded a traitor. All this Julia heard, standing outside the door, and could not believe her ears. To his father, she is evidence that the one he loved has been defiled by his own father. To his mother, Julia is the daughter of a hated woman, a woman who stole the heart of her beloved husband and humiliated her greatly. And finally, to society, she is the daughter of a family of traitors. Simeon suddenly hears someone fall outside the door. He opens the door and sees Julia lying on the floor. Glenn sees this and takes her in his arms. The prince wonders if she heard what they were talking about. The prince then asks Glenn to think it over carefully, if he doesn't want the Vestris family to end up like Lagrange. As he leaves, the prince asks Simeon not to see him off. Glenn puts Julia on the bed and does not understand what has happened. Simeon asks to address Glenn. He asks permission to say this, not as a servant, but as his longtime friend. He asks to keep Julia. Glenn starts to scream and hopes he's joking and asks how he can say that. Simeon asks if he's willing to spit on everything, his father, his stepmother, and the people who serve his family, the knights who follow him, and him too. Simeon says that if it makes him happy, he'll gladly accept his fate, but he's different from Camille. He asks how someone as kind and sincere as Glenn could give up everything, trample everything but Julia and rejoice. He's bound to be tormented by guilt, and Simeon doesn't want his dear friend to be unhappy. Glenn doesn't know what to say. Simeon continues. It's the same with Julia. He asks if Glenn thinks she wouldn't suffer if he dropped everything. Glenn says that can't be the case, as she is an incredibly kind person. Simeon in no way suggests giving up on Julia. He talks about giving up the thought of being with her. The burden of sins she carries is too great. As long as she is in the kingdom of Arcadia, there will be no peace for her. If he wants to make Julia happy, he needs to set her free, to free her from her transgressions, to help her escape to a place where the evil minds of this country and Camille's reckless stubbornness won't get her. We must give her that opportunity. It's what can do for her happiness. Glenn realizes that everything is as Simeon says. Julia, while asleep, sees the same boy. He waits and goes somewhere. She runs after him and stops. The boy says something. Julia remembers her childhood. She watches her parents and runs off somewhere. In the yard, she sees this boy again, standing sideways and turning his head in her direction. She asks who he is, but the boy turns his head back. Julia asks if he came with that uncle, but there is silence in response. Afterwards, she tries to find out his name, but the boy is silent. When she takes his hand and smiles at him, the boy doesn't understand anything. Julia says it's good that her big brother can keep his mouth shut. She offers him a cup of tea. The cozy cabin in the woods has a life of its own. The cook says the food is ready and it is time to eat. The father says it is okay to decorate Mrs. Celestina's rooms with flowers. She, her mother, and 2 kind servants. The boy's father approaches her and asks her to keep his son company for a while. It's the mother's acquaintance who sometimes drops by. When he comes over, she's always escorted out of the room. They're discussing something important. With him was a boy she could only see in those moments. Standing in front of him, she tells him he may not say his name and asks if he likes sweets. Her world was tiny and confined. She never felt any discomfort and was happy. But one day when she was sitting in the garden, some man was watching her. The man changes in his face and takes his head with his hands. Julia does not realize what is happening. The man asks himself how much longer he needs to be mocked before he finally calms down. The man reaches out to her, but suddenly a servant comes running into the garden. The man is already holding the girl in his arms and shouts. She doesn't remember further events, ever again. Julia wakes up abruptly in a cold sweat and stares fearfully at nothing. Glenn runs into the room and asks what's wrong. He hugs her and asks if she had a nightmare. He says it's okay because the scary stuff is over. Julia starts to cry. After a while, Glenn asks if she has calmed down. She says that her memories have come back to her, albeit a little. She realizes that His Highness was right. She is Julie de Lagrange. Celestine is her mother. In the afternoon, Simeon asks to come in. Julia apologizes. She just wanted to replace the flowers with new ones. Glenn is very happy to see her. He thanks her and says it lifts her spirits. Simeon says that Glenn is working now, and when she is done, asks her to leave the room. Glenn starts to object. Julia hears all of this, apologizes for interrupting, and says she will leave now. Simeon would appreciate it if she did that. Glenn begins to object again when Julia has already left the room. Glenn turns to him, telling him that his behavior has not been very kind. Julia outside the room recalls the prince's words. She realizes that it is not surprising that he does not want someone like her by his master's side. She also recalls Simeon's words. She realizes that everyone else is kind to her, but because they don't know the whole situation. If they knew she was a threat to their master, their relationship would be very different. If she thought of her master's fate, she shouldn't be here anymore. She realizes this, but she wants to be there for him. Mr. Glenn is the first person she should worry about, and she prioritizes her own desires. She wonders if it's because she found out about the royal lineage. That's why everyone has these arrogant feelings. She thinks back to Gregory and Camille, their behavior. Suddenly, a girl bursts in. She asks if it's all true that that girl is a descendant of a family of cheaters. Glenn doesn't understand how she knows. The girl starts screaming and asks again if it's true. She says that Duchess Leroy told her about it over tea. It turns out the Duke's fiancé comes from a family of traitors. But it is not only she who knows about it. Everyone knew about it, only she was not aware of it. She would not exaggerate if she said that the tea party was held to learn from him the true state of affairs, surprised that the rumors have spread so far. The girl doesn't know that and doesn't want to know. She asks if he knows how ashamed she was at the time. He said she comes from a lineage so honorable that she possesses the harness. He'd promised to pay for her efforts, so she'd agreed to help. The thought of Ophelia manipulating her and looking down on her was unpleasant. But considering she could be related to royalty, there were more advantages. She even antagonizes her. She asks if Ophelia wasn't the better party. Glenn reasons that judging by Suzanne's speech, the rumors will remain that Julia is a member of the Lagrange family. That she is the daughter of the previous king and half-sister to the current king is not common. However, he wonders how this came to be known. Simeon assumes that His Highness must be resentful as well. The girls in the garden ask what will happen now. Julia is congratulated on the return of her memories. She has heard rumors that she is related to the Marquis family. Many people will say that the family met their demise because of treason. But when she was recruited here, she wondered if they were deceiving everyone about having noble blood. She had often spoken of her anxiety after all, the girl asks. She thinks it's very scary not knowing who you are, so if she's free of that fear. Suddenly she stops and asks if she's said anything too much. Julia apologizes and says that she probably hasn't quite recovered yet. When the girl suggests postponing today's lesson, she has wasted her time. Julia says she can't go on like this. She can't be around the gentleman anymore. She swings open the large doors to Glenn's office and turns to Simeon. She's heard that rumors have spread. She asks that His Highness be contacted. She can no longer afford to trouble the royal family or the ducal family. She's going to leave this place. Glenn can't believe his ears. Simeon asks if she wants to ask His Highness for help. Julia replies that she doesn't. Now that there are many rumors, if she disappears without thinking of the consequences, it will cause a new wave of commotion. If there are more rumors, it could damage the reputation of His Highness, His Majesty, and Mr. Glenn. That's unacceptable. She wants to disappear in the best way possible without affecting the people around her. She will need the help of a witty man in this endeavour. Simeon apologises for putting Mr. Glenn first. Julia says there's nothing to apologise for, because Mr. Glenn comes first for her too. All this time, Glenn sits there and is silent. He can't say anything, but you can see from his face that he is very tense. Suddenly he snaps out of his seat and asks why she is leaving, because he loves her too. She lets it slip that her heart is very attached to him, and that is why she needs to be out of his life. Camille comes to see Julia. He asks if she was expecting to meet him, and she must have questions for him, and many things she would like to know about. Julia doesn't understand what is going on. Camille says he will answer and tell her everything, that everything is fine. He will never leave her, and nothing is more important to him than her. Camille says he will drop everything and choose her without a second thought, unlike the greedy and weak-willed hearts. He says that if Glenn truly loves her, no circumstance should stand in the way of his feelings. You just have to love and give your best to that love. So he is a man who is not ready for that. He is no match for her. Julia asks not to speak that way about Mr. Glenn. Camille apologizes and says that it is not good to say bad things about a benefactor. He wouldn't want to judge the Duke much either. After all, he is a wonderful man. It's just that his love doesn't compare in strength to his. Slowly but surely, she sees for herself what is more precious to him when faced with a choice, says Camille. Mr. Camille's words eat away at her heart. Camille says he won't do that because she is the only and unconditional one for him. He apologizes for hurting her with his peculiar way of expressing his love, saying that he is really sorry. However, he only wants her to trust that he loves her. He will give up everyone and everything for her. Julia realizes that Camille is very cruel and dangerous. Camille says that he will never leave her alone and will be by her side until death do them part. Julia says that she treats Mr. Glenn with respect and love, but she is afraid of Mr. Camille. She no longer wants to experience those feelings again. Camille apologizes for everything that happened. He says he just didn't want her to be taken away from him, so he acted recklessly. He wasn't okay at the time and was even afraid of himself. He says he will never act violently towards her again. He swears. He says he won't put her in chains or ban her from her room anymore, and he won't do anything she doesn't like. He will always be there for her and keep her safe from everything. Glenn's voice is heard from behind the door. He says he wants to talk again, and he has no intention of resisting her resolve. Camille looks towards the door and starts to smile. He says that she is busy right now and asks him to come back later. Glenn hears a man's voice and doesn't realize what it is. The door swings open and Mr. Glenn enters the room. He sees Camille in front of him. Camille says that alas, that is not his real name, and pulls his hand behind his back. Glenn doesn't know what he means and tells him to stay away from Julia. Camille says it's like he got it off his tongue. Suddenly, Camille sprawls and pulls a blade out of his back. Julia is very badly startled. She says she doesn't have to do anything. She rushes to Glenn's side and, hugging him, covers the impact of the blade. Unfortunately, the blade pierces them both, and they fall to the floor together in an embrace. Glenn opens his eyes and sees Camille picking Julia up off the floor. He asks what the man is going to do. Camille brings his hand to the wound and begins to heal it. Glenn realizes this. He asks what it means. Marquis Lafayette said that Camille's harness was weak and could only be used to break spells. Glenn, based on Julia's words, thought that Camille could not only break the spell, but also cast it. However, this contradicts not only Marquis's story, but also Julia's words. Glenn doesn't realize what this healing arcana is. He asks Camille how he did it. Camille asks if Glenn knew from Julia's stories that his arcana was weak and only good for casting or breaking spells. Camille explains that it's all a lie. The Marquis had deceived them, and there was no need to take his words as truth. Camille tells us that the Lafayette family consisted of 7 members: the Marquis and Marquise, their oldest son Gregory, 2 younger brothers, and 2 younger sisters. With 6 people murdered, there was never any second son of Camille's. Glenn asks who he really is, but he gets worse and can't keep talking. He sees Julia's image in front of him, calls her name, and says that he promised to protect her, but he failed. Camille walks to the window with a smile and says that his real name is Camille de Lagrange. Suddenly, Simeon and the servants hear shouting from Julia's room. It was Glenn. They run into the room and see a wounded Glenn lying on the floor. After a while, Julia wakes up in an incomprehensible room. She wonders where she is. The room was beautiful, but she doesn't remember being here before. Suddenly she remembers what happened recently and assumes it was a dream, but she is interrupted by Camille entering the room. He was glad she was awake and wondered if anything hurt. The healing must have worked perfectly. Julia realizes it wasn't a dream. She asks why he did it. Camille realizes she's talking about the Duke and explains that he took her from him and got what he deserved. Julia hears from Glenn that Camille brutally murdered his loved ones and put the blame on Gregory. Camille interjects to ask if she's talking about the Marquis's family. In fact, they are not his loved ones, but just scum, unworthy of life. He asks her not to count him among them. Julia asks what made him change so much and where the good Mr. Camille went. She says that she loves Glenn and will not have him. Camille says that is why she can't be with him, because she is a child of Lagrange. Julia suddenly realizes that he knows everything. Camille catches her thinking and tells her that of course he knows everything. He crawls over to her and tells her that this is reality and it's unchangeable, and that she's better off with him because she's taken everything from him. Julia doesn't realize what exactly she took away and asks about it. Camille says his name is Camille de Lagrange, just like hers.